Thank you again for being here today, and now let's get started with the session. Clint Carroll is an associate professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. A citizen of the Cherokee Nation, he works at the intersections of Indigenous studies, anthropology, and political ecology, with an emphasis on Cherokee environmental governance and land-based resurgence. Currently, he is working with Cherokee elders, students, and Cherokee Nation staff on an integrated education and research project that investigates Cherokee access to wild plants in northeastern Oklahoma amid shifting climate conditions and fractionated tribal lands. Funded by the National Science Foundation and the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, his work aims to advance methods and strategies for Indigenous land education and community-based conservation. Please join me in welcoming Clint Carroll.
Wado, thank you, Molly. Osio Negadawo. Hold on while I pull my slides up. Osio Negadawo. Hello, everyone. Ukahati Sigwani Ohada Wado. Ale Galieliga. Jidedo Akohega. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm honored to be invited to share my work and thoughts with you. I want to thank the organizers and to the tech support. I want to thank the tech support team as well for ensuring that everything runs smoothly. And I want to also thank all of you for joining today and for the dedication you bring to the work of landscape care, which is a topic and practice for which I share a passion. I'm joining you today from the homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. I live in Longmont, Colorado, and as Molly said, I teach at the University of Colorado at Boulder, which also occupies those territories. Today, I hope to tell you about my work in regard to the theme or the broad area of landscape care, specifically my work with my tribal community, the Cherokee Nation, in the hopes that the broader context for this work can apply to how we all think about both landscapes and the care or stewardship of them. I'll frame my talk with a broad discussion of the historical and environmental factors that have shaped many Indigenous nations' relationship to land. Then I'll delve into the specific impacts these forces have had on Cherokee people and lands, followed by a discussion of my ongoing work as a way to illuminate how we as Cherokee people are addressing the challenges we face as a result. So just to start out, I wanted to see, I'm pretty sure that you all are experts here, but I wanted to see if there were any guesses as to which plant I'm showing on the title slide today. And so if you want to throw some guesses, or if you're certain, throw the answer in the chat, and just to kind of start things off. All right, yeah, I knew this was going to be an easy one for you all. American ginseng, that's correct. So this image is of the aerial parts here, and then of course this is a rootlet. It's about a 2-year-old, if I'm not mistaken, rootlet of American ginseng. In Cherokee, this is one of our 7 sacred plants, and we call it, there's a few names that we have for this plant. Odalgot is one of them, and that means mountain climber. And that describes where it grows and where it can be found in our homelands. And specifically, that would be the southeastern United States, what is now known as the southeastern United States. The Appalachian Mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains specifically. This plant is known to grow on the north-facing slopes of hills and mountains. So we call it Odal Ka, so mountain climber. But another name for it that we have, an older name for it, is Yawi Gadoga. And that means person, a standing person, someone who is standing up. And you might be able to, for those of you who are familiar with this plant, as I see in the chat here, many of you are, you might be able to deduce why it's called person standing. Here in this small, young 2-year-old rootlet, you can kind of see, if you were to flip this over, what we might call the head of the root and the beginnings of the formation of the limbs. But if you look at a much older root, you can certainly see why that it carries that name in the Cherokee language. But a little bit of context for these photos. These photos were taken not in North Carolina or the Blue Ridge Mountains. These photos were taken in the Cherokee Reservation, Cherokee Nation Reservation in what is now known as the state of Oklahoma. And they represent a lot to me. I was involved in this attempted reintroduction of ginseng, of our sacred plant, back in 2008 and 2009. This one, of course, this photo here was taken as we were planting these rootlets. And this photo here was taken a year later in hopes of reestablishing this plant as a result of hearing from our elders and our medicine keepers and knowledge holders that people couldn't find this plant anymore, and that they once did, or at least they had heard stories of being able to find this plant in certain places. And it's as a result of numerous things, but the story that many people tell is that this is one of the plants that Cherokee people brought with them on the Trail of Tears, or the forced relocation in the late 1830s, 1838, 1839. And due to numerous factors that I'll go into more detail today, people have not been able to find this plant anymore, despite the fact that it's still very much a sacred being, a sacred plant relative to us, and that is used in many different applications, but most specifically medicine, traditional medicine. And so these photos mean a lot to me because it highlights in understanding what they are and the context in which they were taken, what we've lost as a result of colonialism and forced removal. And it's not just plants or access to plants, but our ancestors who passed on the trail, the lands that we were connected to as home, our medicines like ginseng here, as well as a lot of knowledge that we've lost as a result of that displacement and dispossession from our homelands. But these photos also represent how we are rebuilding and revitalizing. So what many of us in Indigenous studies term resurgence or Indigenous resurgence, using the direction of our elders who have managed to hold on to our cultural knowledge and our language that encodes a lot of our cultural knowledge. So that's why I like to start with this slide specifically, is because they speak volumes to really the broad topic that I want to touch on today. And so moving into setting this up, setting a framework for the larger talk, I like to quote here my colleague Kyle White. He's a Potawatomi scholar, and he's thinking here and writing about settler colonialism and its relationship to the current proposed geological era that we all occupy today, the Anthropocene. And he writes, the environmental impacts of settler colonialism mean that quite a few Indigenous peoples in North America are no longer able to relate locally to many of the plants and animals that are significant to them. In the Anthropocene, then, some Indigenous peoples already inhabit what our ancestors would have likely characterized as a dystopian future. So we consider the future from what we believe is already a dystopia. And I think this quote is very useful for me in setting up the context for the more specific projects and activities that I will go into detail later on, as well as just Indigenous resurgence projects throughout North America and throughout the Americas and even throughout the globe, is that the experience of colonialism in the way that White paints it here has been something akin to the end of the world, and the end of a world for many Indigenous peoples. And so what we do proceeding from that experience and that knowledge is work to recreate worlds in which we can flourish alongside our other than humans or more than human relatives, including plants, animals, waterways, the land itself. And so I pair this quote with another one by a colleague of mine, Daniel Wildcat, to illuminate the specific challenges that climate change has posed, and also to put this in a broader historical context of removal, and how climate change, according to Dan Wildcat, represents a fourth removal in a series of previous removals that many Indigenous peoples, including the Cherokee Nation, have had to react to and contend with. And he writes, "I get angry when I think about global warming. I get angry because I know the history of involuntary removals and relocations Indigenous peoples throughout the United States and around the world have endured. So when I began hearing the reports of Indigenous displacement as a result of climate change, I got angry. I thought, here we go again, another removal of Indigenous peoples." And so what I want to talk about today, after having set this up in a broad way, are the four removals that Wildcat is describing here, with specific reference to Cherokee people. And once again, how this has presented numerous challenges and obstacles to us, how it continues to present challenges and obstacles given the fact that climate change is here and is ongoing, and also, perhaps more importantly, how Cherokee people are responding and reacting to them. So I highlight here in this map by Mark Lindberg, who I collaborated with to put together not only a geographical representation of past Cherokee homelands, or I should say Cherokee homelands that are still inhabited in some part by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, right around here, and where our current lands as the Cherokee Nation, which is one of three federally recognized Cherokee tribes, the other being the United Keetoowah Band, which also resides in northeastern Oklahoma. But not just a geographical representation, but a representation of the topography and also the ecoregions that Cherokee people once inhabited, and as I said, some still do, and how that compares and contrasts to our current lands, speaking specifically with regard to the Cherokee Nation and the United Keetoowah Band. And so you'll notice here, as I mentioned, the Blue Ridge mountain range. This is generally identified as our core settlement area, and then the extent of our homelands and what we knew intimately represented roughly by this outer polygon here. As a result of the Trail of Tears, as I said, which occurred in 1838, 1839, Cherokee people were forcibly marched hundreds of miles to the west, to what was then Indian territory, and quite simply the Cherokee Nation, and what has become known as Oklahoma as of 1907. And you'll notice here that we are on the westernmost extent of the Ozark Highlands and the Boston Mountains, specifically in this eastern portion of our current reservation. And we straddle that extent with the Central Irregular Plains the further you go west. And what's important here is to understand and highlight not only the geographical difference between these two places, but of course the biological difference, the difference in biodiversity that is represented by the Appalachians broadly and the Ozark Mountains. And so I just highlight here a couple of images of the homelands, the Blue Ridge Mountains in what is now known as North Carolina. And I wanted to quote a colleague of mine, Alfie Vick, who wrote a paper. It's a really interesting paper regarding the impact of the removal on our ability as Cherokee people to relate to plants. And he writes, the Southern Appalachian Mountains are considered one of the most botanically diverse temperate ecoregions in the world. These mountains were formed roughly 425 million years ago and have remained relatively stable over the last 200 million years, allowing for the evolution of tremendous biodiversity, including over 130 species of trees, 1,500 species of flowering plants, and over 4,000 species of other plants. Well, we contrast and compare this landscape with the region that I mentioned earlier, the westernmost extent of the Ozark Highlands. And we see here a lot of differences in terms of the dramatic, the topography and the lessened dramatic hills and valleys, but a lot of similarities as well. And Cherokee people saw these similarities after removal. And in fact, removal wasn't only punctuated by the Trail of Tears in the late 1830s, but Cherokee people had been migrating west decades before that time. In fact, some have argued centuries before that time, due to the colonial pressures that they were experiencing in the homelands. And so one could say that Cherokee people had begun getting to know these lands much earlier, some say as early as 1721, I believe. But Cherokee people were forcibly relocated to this area here, which is now known as the Cherokee Nation Reservation. Many of our communities decided to settle in this area here because of this familiar topography, and most importantly, because of the familiar plant and animal species that one could find in that area. And so picking up on Alfie Vick again, he writes, of the 739 plants that are documented to have been used by the Cherokee Indians prior to removal, 230 of them are not native to Oklahoma. That is 31.1% of the plant species that were utilized for medicine, food, fiber, dye, and other uses were not found growing naturally in the new landscape that awaited Cherokees at the terminus of the Trail of Tears. And so what this opens up for thought and for consideration is that forced relocation and dispossession on this scale, and many other indigenous nations experienced forced relocation. It wasn't just the Cherokee Nation, but not only severs relationships to land, but severs relationships to the knowledge and the beings that land holds. And so that impacted Cherokee people as well as numerous other indigenous peoples regarding our knowledge and relationships to land. Furthermore, this map here, you'll recognize the polygon or this cutout here as the Cherokee Nation Reservation. There were other removals that happened, as I alluded to previously with Dan Wildcat's quote, even after forced relocation from our homelands. And the way Dan Wildcat talks about it is the second removal, in addition to or after actual dispossession, was the allotment policy. And what this represents here is a contemporary map of Cherokee Nation lands, the extent of our reservation border. But what you see here are in the darker areas are the tribal trust lands that Cherokee people have managed to hold on to. And it's a little bit more complex than that historically, but I won't get into the details. The takeaway here is that despite the fact that before the allotment policy was enforced upon Cherokee people, the allotment policy was passed. The act was called the General Allotment Act. It was passed in 1887. It was finally enforced upon the Cherokee Nation after many years of resistance to it in the early 1900s, leading up to Oklahoma statehood in 1907. But following that act, forgive me here, the extent of the lands within our reservation boundary, 4.42 million acres, were owned in full by the Cherokee people in common. And so after allotment, that land holding, or that the size of those lands was decreased to 100,000 acres. And this is over the course of decades, but nonetheless, that's what we're left with today in terms of tribal trust lands. and that represents 98% land loss even after removal from our homelands that were taken out from under our feet, so to speak. The idea behind this policy was the privatization of property. As I mentioned, lands were owned communally by the Cherokee Nation. And so this was an assault not only at our relationship to our lands, our new lands, so to speak, but also was an assault on our way of understanding how we relate to one another. And so what happened was the allotment policy forced us to privatize lands essentially through a process of allotting to individual tribal citizens, trust lands, individual trust lands as they call them, and then opening up the remaining lands to non-Indian settlement. And this contributed to the massive losses of land for Native peoples across the United States, not just Cherokee people. It was a devastating US policy in this regard. The third removal that Wildcat refers to, and specifically with regard to the Cherokee Nation in this talk, was boarding schools. And he writes about this in terms of the removal of children from Native families, from Indigenous families. And we can see that in a way as also severely impacting our relationship to land because of the continuity that was impacted of our knowledge of place and our generational knowledge of these lands, as I said, that Cherokee people had been getting to know since as early as 1721. The fourth removal that Wildcat refers to, of course, is climate change. And I want to just include a couple other bullet points here. As I've mentioned, Oklahoma statehood came about in 1907. We can also talk about the criminalization of indigenous religions in the context of the assimilation policy during this time as well, impacting our relationship to lands vis-a-vis our spirituality, our indigenous forms of spirituality, our religions, so to speak. So this is a lot to take in. But what I want to get across here is despite all of this loss, Cherokee people didn't stop using plant medicine, didn't stop practicing our traditions. Our relationality to the land persisted in ways that I've come to describe as relational continuity. In other words, we maintained our understanding of ourselves in relation to the world around us as Indigenous people, despite the fact that we were removed geographically, and despite the fact that many impositions had been made upon our society regarding forced assimilation. We persisted, we innovated, and we adapted then. As I mentioned, with regard to the initial pictures of American ginseng, Cherokee people transported seeds, medicines, roots, but we also learned about the new lands through observation, so indigenous science, as well as the spiritual aspects that are included within that term, indigenous science. So through divination, through communion with the earth, as well as with the creator. And most importantly, we're still innovating and adapting today. So how are we adapting? These are some things that represent what Cherokee people are doing, and I'm involved in a few of them, as well as some aspirational goals for thinking about where we could be looking as a nation to continue that adaptation, that process of adaptation into the future. Well, as I'll be talking about more in a few minutes, we're revitalizing our traditional knowledge and practices. We are planning responses to decreased access to our plant relatives on existing tribal lands. And we're doing so by securing gathering rights further east, as well as establishing tribal conservation areas, and in the future, hopefully some greenhouses as a part of these related activities to grow out some of our more sensitive plants. And thinking about kind of aspirational goals, looking to diversify our food system and medicines, perhaps through knowledge exchanges with other indigenous nations that are more familiar with the plants and ecosystems just further west of Cherokee people today. So what I want to highlight really quickly before I move on is going back to this slide. This precarious position or has this geographic location of the Cherokee Nation has turned out to be quite a precarious location for us, specifically because of climate change and the impacts that climate change is having on the plants that, again, we're very familiar with within these hills and valleys of the Ozark Highlands. And so to illuminate a little bit about what I just said, we are looking toward Central Arkansas, what is now known as Central Arkansas, to establish gathering rights with the Buffalo National River. In fact, that gathering agreement was just passed and just recognized last April, so almost a year ago. I can say a little bit more about that later. But we're also conserving areas within our tribal lands to reserve them for specifically cultural uses and preservation. And so these are some of the ways that Cherokee people are reacting to some of the challenges that we see, including higher annual temperatures, erratic weather patterns that are threatening the plants that grow on the very small parcels of land that we have left. So within that goal, we can look to further future aspirations for reacquiring tribal lands that were lost as a result of that allotment policy. So in this context, I've been working with a group of knowledge keepers and elders known as the Cherokee Nation Medicine Keepers since their formation in 2008. So we've been working together for quite a while. I was responsible before I even began my graduate studies at UC Berkeley. I was responsible for conducting a tribal ethnobotany project that entailed interviewing and meeting with and developing relationships with elders and knowledge keepers throughout the Cherokee Reservation. And throughout this work, I had been talking to individuals, but my supervisor and I wanted to see what would happen if we brought everyone together to recognize that there was more than just me as the face of this proposed project. And what happened as a result is they formed, and my role as facilitator has persisted along with numerous Cherokee Nation staff in the Office of the Secretary for Natural Resources. They are a small group, about 10 to 12 individuals of fluent speaking Cherokee elders who function as an advisory council to that office, specifically on ethnobiological issues. And their mission is to perpetuate Cherokee knowledge of wild plants and to preserve the health of Cherokee lands for the benefit of present and future generations. Just to put a few faces to the group, this is an image of some, not all of the medicine keepers, but some of them who were able to attend the banquet and to accept a community leadership award from the Cherokee Nation during our holiday celebrations in 2017. And so this is our former Principal Chief Bill John Baker awarding the Community Leadership Award. Here pictured is Crosland Smith. He is a renowned Cherokee healer. He's a practicing medicine person and is 93 as of last November. And I work with him very closely on a number of other projects that I'm happy to discuss later. If you want to learn more, I just wanted to plug this. It's a book that I published in 2015. All of the proceeds go back to the work of the medicine keepers through a Cherokee Nation fund. So if you want to learn more about this group in the context of our history, both political and environmental history, you can check out that book. What I'm up to now is a continuation of these relationships, this relationship with the medicine keepers, and really looking at their desire to not only preserve and preserve knowledge among themselves and inform the way that our nation manages and relates to lands within our reservation, but to perpetuate that actively by working with younger Cherokee people. And so way back in, I want to say 2016, I floated the idea of applying to a grant called the Early Career Faculty Award from the National Science Foundation. We discussed what this award could look like, what the proposal would look like. I went back and formulated and drafted a proposal, and fortunately we were awarded this grant in 2017 for 5 years. And due to COVID, we've had some obvious obstacles to contend with. So we have a no-cost extension. This work is ongoing, and the formal grant will conclude in 2023, so this year. But nonetheless, the way that the grant is set up is that it must have a research as well as an education component. And so this was an opportunity for the Medicine Keepers and I to design a land education curriculum that would actively teach a cohort of Cherokee students perspectives on environmental policy, land management, traditional knowledge, that the elders, as well as the Cherokee Nation staff who we work with, had to offer this group of students. The research component, I'll talk about those, the big questions in a moment, but the students also participate as research assistants to me in our work with 3 Cherokee communities in Oklahoma, and we use surveys, interviews, and participatory mapping in order to really understand the research goals, our questions, understanding how Cherokee people are navigating and responding to ongoing social and environmental challenges, how Cherokee people see this influencing their overall health, and then lastly, how Cherokee's responses might inform comprehensive strategies for climate change adaptation, tribal land conservation, and cultural revitalization. So all of this is within that bigger picture that I hoped to paint earlier regarding the historical and environmental factors that are impacting our relationships to land, but also how Cherokee people are responding to that. And this next slide just shows what's called a code cloud that highlights some of the big issues that we've been able to get at in our survey and interview work thus far. Again, with 3 Cherokee communities in northeastern Oklahoma. And you see here, again, just not only the political issues, which are highlighted as private property, access or lack thereof, and that is a result of the allotment policy that we continue to struggle with today, but also environmental impacts that one could say are directly related to that policy. So overgrowth, the absence of cultural burning that Cherokee people and many other indigenous communities throughout North America apply to the land as a way to increase the health of those landscapes and to increase the availability and access of cultural use plants and animals for that matter. So this is just a snapshot. I won't go into detail with the research project today. What I want to focus on in the remaining time that I have is the approach that we've been taking to land education or indigenous land-based education for Cherokee people. And this is manifested in what we call the Cherokee Environmental Leadership Program. So it's a 3-year pilot program that began in summer of 2018. This was, as I said, built upon past and ongoing relationship with the Cherokee Medicine Keepers. We designed a curriculum in the first year of the grant and beginning in fall of 2017. And we continue to partner with the Cherokee Nation Secretary of Natural Resources Office. And we have additional funding from the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, as Molly mentioned in my introduction. And so this was a way for us to re-envision education from not only a land-based, but a intimately Cherokee-based perspective. And interestingly, the elders decided that the program would address not only Cherokee approaches to science and knowledge about the land, but also we would draw on the strengths that our tribal biologist offered in the Secretary of Natural Resources Office. So where and when appropriate, we draw upon Western science. The program includes relevant policy and management issues that pertain to our land and territory, and as well as I mentioned, community-based research for the students. And so the overall goal is really to build a cohort of tribal environmental leaders who can take on the issues, the complex issues we face using all of these approaches. So a holistic and multifaceted approach to land education. And we begin with thinking about some quotes from our elders and members of the Medicine Keepers. And I mentioned this term relational continuity earlier. This is an embodiment for me, or an example of how Crosland talks about this with regard to Cherokee people. And he says, we have to do something to honor the spirit of this land. And this is, of course, in the context of these lands that we know now as home. Cherokee people in Oklahoma are not our homelands, but it's still our responsibility to caretake them. It's still our responsibility to honor them and honor the spirits, the spirit of the land, the many spirits that inhabit this region. As Indigenous people, it's our obligation, it's our responsibility. Gary Van, another one of our Cherokee medicine keepers, says, and this was during the curriculum development workshop, we were always told, you come from the land and everything you need comes from the land. It's your fault if you go hungry. And this may seem a little harsh, but it's a reminder that was given to Gary by his parents and grandparents that there is no separation between yourself as a human being and the land itself. You come from the land, and the knowledge that has been passed down to you by his family members is his responsibility to continue to enact those relationships of care, and also the knowledge that the land is there to care for you. It's a reciprocal relationship. And so it's your fault if you go hungry is a way of saying that if you fail to continue to recognize this relationship to place and to other than human beings, that's going to impact your very well-being and your very the health of you and your family. This is an image here of our curriculum development workshop, and I like to show this because those are big words that we consider. We might associate them with boardrooms and fluorescent lights and rolling chairs, but here we're seated around a fire, we're outdoors. That was a very intentional thing, and it's a way that the medicine keepers prefer to conduct their activities. Is when the weather is amenable to it, we meet outside, and we always light a fire as a way of honoring that elemental, that very important element of creation and our connection to it. So as a result of these curricula, we had 2 workshop days. The elders, the medicine keepers, developed a set of guiding principles. And here they're expressed in the Cherokee language, and this is the Cherokee syllabary. If you're not familiar with it, it may look somewhat like some English alphabet characters, but they're pronounced entirely different. So the first principle, building a strong relationship to the land. So we say in Cherokee, Nigada Gusti Di Dada Ni. So this expresses in the Cherokee language a concept that is that can be expressed in many Indigenous languages. In fact, it is, I wouldn't say universal, but it's very much a common theme throughout Indigenous languages, is to have a way of expressing relationality in its most expansive sense. So our elder here, John Ross, offered this up and specifically stated this is not just about us being distantly related as human beings, or maybe immediately related, cousins, et cetera, et cetera. This implies and this extends to our relationship to other than human beings, the land itself, plants, animals, waterways, the spirits that inhabit the land. Again, it's an expansive way of understanding relationality. The second principle, Squayohaga, is how you would say that in Cherokee. Glossed, it means teach me, but the literal translation is show me. And this is a way of emphasizing that in Cherokee circles and Cherokee community spaces, teaching is not hierarchical, or at least it shouldn't be done in a hierarchical fashion. Generally, you show people how to do something. And that's why our word for teach me literally means show me how to do it. And so it's experiential as well. And so the students the elders designed this as a way of emphasizing that students should be shown how to do something. It should be active. It should also be a lateral way of understanding our relationships to one another, as opposed to many of the contexts in which our elders had to learn forcibly through the boarding school system. The opposite of what I've just described. The third one, communalism and an interdependence. Skino gigaweska in the Cherokee language means if we work together, we'll get somewhere. And so this implies togetherness, communalism, as well as reliance upon one another for all the strengths that we bring as individuals. It also implies a futurity that if we do this in a good way and we do it together, things will happen. And lastly, and perhaps even most importantly, Ali Heliji Dasti, having a good time or enjoying yourselves, something that is super important that the elders wanted to convey, that if the students and the elders and me as facilitator and the staff weren't enjoying themselves, then it wouldn't be a Cherokee space. It wouldn't be a space of learning that emphasizes this very important value of laughter, enjoyment. And, one of my colleagues here, a friend of mine, has said, what's more radical as a result of all this history of colonialism and politics, what's more radical than Indigenous peoples enjoying, expressing or experiencing joy on the land? And I think that's a profound way to think about things. And so I am nearly out of time. I have a few images that maybe I can describe as a way to just give you a picture of some of the activities that we do, and highlighting some of the people involved in this work. And then I'll wrap up, and I think we'll have some time for engagement and Q&A. But this here was an activity that we conducted out on a tract of tribal land that the Cherokee Nation has now preserved or established as a medicine, the Medicine Keepers Preserve. And so this is where we conduct a lot of our land-based activities. This one specifically, Anna Sixkiller, our medicine keeper there, and then John Ross on Looking, also our medicine keeper, one of our medicine keepers, is showing the students how to crack open hickory nuts. So wild harvested hickory nuts that are then going to go into this basin here. This is called a canon. The students then pounded them down with a wooden pestle, if you will, called an astosti, to create the natural oils in the nuts are released, and you can create a ball that we call a kanachi ball to make later into a very delicious fall and winter dish that you submerge that ball of hickory nuts into boiling water, strain it. Typically people add hominy and enjoy that as kind of a soup, but it's very comforting. It's also very nutritious. And again, it's something that is considered a delicacy in the fall and winter time. So here the students are learning how to make that dish from scratch using wild harvested hickory nuts themselves. And then sometimes the program will have impromptu activities around a specific plant that the students observe or notice. Ask an elder. This is Gary Van teaching some of our students about Baldwin's ironweed. We call it san in the Cherokee language. But these are this opportunity of, again, expressing and experiencing joy out on the land comes with these impromptu moments of education that aren't necessarily structured at all, that just happen spontaneously, and perhaps that's the best way that they can come about. This was during the spring of 2018, I believe. 2019 could have been. As you can tell, it's pretty cold. It was drizzling that day. But here Crosland is talking about one of the books, his first book that he published that I've helped him with. And so the curriculum includes spiritual knowledge from our medicine keepers, as well as the more specific knowledge of plants and animals. And so this book that Crosland wrote, that I'm happy to talk about later, talks about a lot of what we call our Katua or original Cherokee understandings of how we came to be in this world and our responsibilities as Katua or Cherokee people within the world. So with that, I think I'm going to end there because I'm out of time. I'm happy to go through some more pictures in the speaker's garden later on, which I'll hang around for. But Wadon, thank you. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk about my work in the context of what I'm sure is the amazing work that you're all doing with regard to taking care of the land and respecting and valuing our connection to it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clint. In the chat, we have a future speaker, Kristen, who says, this dude is one tough act to follow. So
Oh.
definitely, incredible to hear you to speak. And it strikes me that what an appropriate way to start this conference off, with understanding the historical and political and cultural context in which we develop our own relationships to the land, which is what we're here to, to deepen. So thank you so much. We have a few minutes for Q&A. Feel free to post your questions directly in the chat if you haven't already. And then any questions not answered will be addressed in the speaker garden for track 2. And in the chat, we've had a lot of actual kind of responses and conversation with you, which has been really cool to see. I think what you've been speaking to has resonated a lot. We do have a couple questions already. So one question that we have is, one person said that they're curious about what land-related words don't exist in the language. Are there words for stewardship, nature, wilderness?
Oh, that's a good question. And, forgive me if I don't see anything. Thank you, Molly, for helping me keep track of the chat. I'm seeing a lot of really great comments and questions. So as far as going back to the language, that's a really good question. We think about our words for the equivalent of English language terms that are prevalent today. And you're right. I think that whoever's asking this question is getting at the inability, not really to translate, but the fact that these concepts are couched in a very different way of understanding our relationship to land and to place and to other than human beings. And, whereas I'm sure our speakers, and I want to say I'm not a fluent speaker by any means, I definitely have been privileged to work with the Medicine Keepers, and that has increased my understanding and my fluency or proficiency in the Cherokee language so many times over. But the way that they describe land and environment and conservation is very different. And I'll just give you a brief example. So I mentioned that the land where we practice these activities on was established recently by the Tribal Council, by the Cherokee Nation Council, as the Medicine Keepers Preserve. Well, that's an English term to codify this place and basically ensure that it's preserved into perpetuity for cultural activities. And so, we understand that we have to use English in some of these cases. But the way that the Medicine Keepers describe this place, so in our language, Nawatohiata Nawoti'i, the name that they gave this place is the peaceful place of medicine. And that's another way of understanding this place and what it means to Cherokee people. That's different from a preserve or any kind of other way of understanding conservation or an enclosure, even though this is something that I think is a good thing, and all the Medicine Keepers I'm sure would agree. The way you express that in our language is very different. It implies, well, first, peacefulness. How do people feel when they go there? It implies our relationship to that place as being one tract of land that has not been touched by cattle grazing leases or loblolly pine, silviculture activities. And just as a brief note of context, those are practices that our tribe inherited from the Bureau of Indian Affairs when we assumed self-governance around the early 1990s. And in some respects, Cherokee land managers still practice them. And this is a conflict that we have within our own governance and in our own land management policies, is that we have to weigh or balance in some way these kind of economic practices that were problematically inherited by the colonizing government, and our traditional understandings of connection to place as expressed through the Medicine Keepers. And so this act of establishing the preserve, or this peaceful place of medicine, was a way to say, listen, we're going to honor, at least within our power of our tribal trust tracts, and this one being about 830 to 900 acres, we're going to honor our relationships from a traditional perspective to this place and protect them from any other activities that might affect that relationship. I could speak for a lot longer about additional ways that we're hoping to do this. I saw briefly in the chat, what do you see, how do you see our relationship to land in the next generation? Something like that. Maybe we can address that in that question, but I'm going to stop there and see if Molly has other questions for me.
And that was actually what I was going to ask. The next question was, what will your community look like a generation from now? You can either answer that now. If you'd rather go more in depth in the speaker garden, that's fine too.
Okay, yeah, and that's a great question, and it's something I'm excited to talk about. All of these aspirational goals that I mentioned in one of the slides. That's just the short list. What I'd love to see is the implementation of the idea that was incubated by John Ross. You saw a picture of him in the one with Anna Sixkiller teaching the students how to crack open the hickory nuts. I met him for the first time in the early 2000s, and at that time he had been working on a proposal for a Cherokee National Forest. And it still stands as just that, a proposal, and I'd love to see that enacted. The aspirational goals that it represents, in combination with the work that we've been doing as a collective, if you will, with the medicine keepers, our tribal natural resource managers, the students, myself. I would love to see, according to John and his proposal, 10,000 acres of contiguous, tribally managed and controlled land that would allow us to enact a lot of what I've been describing in a much more comprehensive way. The problem, of course, is the issue of land reacquisition and the fact that that's a very expensive and also practically difficult thing to do as a result of the fractionation of our lands through the allotment policy and private property, development activities, you name it. But if we're talking about pie in the sky, generational goals, that's something that would allow Cherokee people to not only create space for the practice of this knowledge and the practice of our relationality with the land, but train younger folks in a context of using the structure that we might understand as a foreign concept, so a national forest or a national park, but indigenizing it in a way that could also create jobs for tribal citizens who are passionate about connecting to the land and teaching this to younger people, but who are presently doing that on the side. And what would it mean to create a position of a tribal forest ranger, for lack of a better term? It could be something that we express in our language if this were to ever materialize, that would allow a team, a crew of people to put their dedication behind this in a concerted way, and represent that leadership to younger Cherokees coming up. We envision a Cherokee Center for Environmental Education and the Healing Arts that could arise in conjunction with such a tract or a contiguous national forest that would enact and carry out some of the proposals of the medicine keepers to have a storehouse of dried plants that would be available to elders who can't get out on the land due to their mobility or if they're they don't have access to place. And so all of these things, including education for non-Cherokee people to come and visit such an entity, such a place that would help teach other people about how Cherokee people relate to the land, I think is also really important. That this stuff is not just for Cherokee people, but that we have things that we can teach and show the broader society that might benefit us all as well. Thank you all. Thank you, Molly.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second session in the Relationships with the Land track of the 29th Annual ELA Conference. My name is Ree Macchiarolo, and I'm the president of the board of directors, and I'll be your host for the session. We encourage you to please join us with your camera on if you're able to do so. And we are sure that you'll enjoy hearing from our next presenter, Kristen Forrest. Just a couple of announcements first. We want to thank our sponsors for this conference: Pleasant Run Nursery, Understanding Ag, Soil Health Academy, Tick Suits, and Ernst Seeds. We encourage you to visit their rooms, which you can find with all the other rooms on the left side of your browser, and ask them questions regarding their products and services. Their support is critical to this event, and your connection to and interest in them is important for them as well. So stop by and chat them up. Additionally, especially if you're just joining us now, feel free to post your questions in the Zoom chat here during the presentation. We will do everything we can to have all your questions answered during the session. There'll be a little bit of time at the end, and for any questions that weren't answered during this presentation, we ask you to follow the speaker to the speaker garden for speaker garden number 2 for this track, where we'll continue the conversation. If you need CEUs, there's instructions in the main space, and also when you complete your evaluation, that will connect you. There are some boxes you can check off there for the CEUs. But if you're curious about what's available, the tab on the main space gives those instructions. And yeah, so we want to thank all of you who are members. Those of you who are here, if you just want to raise your hand or have a reaction on Zoom, if you're members, we're really grateful for your membership. Your membership helps to shape the direction of the organization. And, we're really grateful for all the contributions from offering feedback and suggestions about the programming, to writing articles for our publications, for volunteering your time on the working committees or hosting eco tours, for presenting webinars, for helping ELA work towards our vision that all people understand and respect their connection to the natural systems and take informed action to support ecological landscapes. If you're not a member yet, or if your membership has lapsed, we're offering a special time-limited 10% discount in combination with this event. So to get this membership, you can complete the session evaluations, and there will be a code provided, and the discount code will also be emailed out to all participants after the conference is over, with the evaluations that go out then as well. Your membership comes with loads of benefits, including discounts to events like these, as well as access to our new member-only publication, Into the Weeds, and other member-only online events. So to check out the full list of benefits, you can go to ecolandscaping.org/membership for more information. And if you haven't done so already, there's still time to register and sign up for tonight's keynote session. The keynote does require a separate ticket, and we'll hear Nancy Lawson talk about a world of discoveries, how science and heart can make you a more ecological gardener. So bring your own dinner and join us back here at 6:30 for this inspirational talk. Okay, thank you for your attention. And now let's get started with the session with Dr. Kristen Forrest. Dr. Forrest is a landscape architecture professional with expertise in cross-cultural meanings of landscape, urban planning, planning for social sustainability, equity and access to nature, democracy in planning and design, and community engagement. She's a public garden leader serving as director of education for 2 major organizations. She's created educational programs for a diverse audience, built community partnerships, participated in organization-wide strategic initiatives, and earned 2 nationally recognized awards for program excellence. Dr. Forrest is also an adjunct instructor in courses and studios for Master of Landscape Architecture students for more than 50 countries in the IMLA International Masters of Landscape Architecture program, based jointly in 2 German natural sciences universities. She also serves as a designer and a participatory planning consultant for community-based collaborative planning with clients including schools, neighborhood groups, a homeless shelter, and an institute for people living with autism. Finally, Dr. Forrest is an author, co-author, and co-editor of multiple books and articles on social aspects of public spaces and the art of community built. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kristen Forrest.
Thank you so much. It's a big honor to be with you all. And the previous presentation was pretty stunning. So I'm kind of like, whoa, I have to follow that. Oh my goodness. Let me get my screen going here. Okay, so thank you so much. It's a real honor to be with this group today. And today I'm going to be telling you all about a forgotten landscape that's going to be restored so that the over 1.4 million people within a half-hour drive of it can come and relax, explore, and enjoy the raw beauty of the Ohio River. Origin Park is a unique urban park set in over 400 acres on the north shore of the Ohio River, located on the Indiana side. The PDF of this presentation is going to be available on the conference website if anybody wants to follow up with that. Just to talk a little bit about the organization behind the park. So we have two entities here. We have Origin Park and we have River Heritage Conservancy. So River Heritage Conservancy was established 7 years ago. Our director is a nationally recognized professional, Susan Rademacher, who was formerly the head of the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, Louisville Olmsted Parks Conservancy, and the editor of Landscape Architecture magazine. We are in a public-private partnership with the city of Clarksville, which is the city that adjoins the park property. We are working now in land acquisition and agreements, developing a management plan and a master plan for the park, fundraising, of course. We're working with Olin Landscape Architects, which is one of the top landscape architecture firms in the world. And we are currently focused on phase 1. We are working, as I said, with the town of Clarksville, which is a small town. It's only about 20,000 residents, but they've got some very progressive urban planning stuff going on. They have historically not really had a downtown, and now they have a dense mixed-use development going on and some adaptive reuse of old buildings, and they're very interested in creating this park to improve the quality of life of their residents. So just a little intro to the region that we're talking about, called Kentuckiana, obviously where Indiana and Kentucky join together. It kind of has its own unique flavor, blending kind of the Midwest with the South, and Louisville is right in the middle of that. So Louisville, with its 1.4 million or so metropolitan area residents, is where it is because of the Ohio River, which is a mile wide and almost 1,000 miles long. Sadly, even though it's always been a strong part of our identity and it's the reason for the city's existence, for a long time, like a lot of American cities, we turned our backs from our downtown waterfront completely and treated it like an industrial dumping ground. Happily, in the last few decades, Louisville's seen a real renaissance of how it approaches and embraces the river, including a beautiful, huge waterfront park. There's a brownfield reclamation, a pedestrian bridge that completely revolutionized how we interact with the river, and on the Indiana side, a greenway, and now Origin Park. So just to give you some images, we have a lot of beautiful bridges, but the river has always been, in some senses, a boundary, a barrier, and we think it should be a connection. So that's what we really advocate for, is that the river should be something that brings us together, unites us, and doesn't separate us. So as I said, in the last 15 years, we've seen some new bridges come up, and the walking bridge, the Big Four Bridge, is an old railroad bridge. It's not in this image, unfortunately, but it's an old railroad bridge that was turned into a pedestrian and cycleway a few years ago, and it's transformed both sides of the river just to show that when you create something fantastic, people will come and use it. So especially the Indiana side has really had a complete renaissance in terms of restaurants, cafes, farmers markets, art installations, festivals, concerts, play spaces, and all kinds of vibrant, healthy developments, all due to this bridge. So we're big believers in creating a green amenity has a transformative effect on a community. Here's a view of downtown Louisville from the Indiana side. So we've moved across the 2nd Street Bridge and into Jeffersonville now. This is a nice example of our beautiful riparian landscapes. The Ohio River watershed is richly biodiverse and home to a lot of fascinating species, including paddlefish. If you have not seen an image of a paddlefish before, or seen one in an aquarium or maybe in nature, definitely Google it because it's a pretty astonishing animal. We've got more than 160 species of fish in the Ohio and some of the greatest biodiversity of freshwater mussels that's known. Now, since we used to have 127 of the nearly 300 freshwater mussel species. Now we've lost 11 to extinction and 46 others are endangered or species of concern. So just to give you a little perspective on where we are and just how interesting this site is and just how ripe it is for some amazing development in the coming years in terms of green infrastructure. Just to give you a little orientation, up in the upper right-hand corner, you see the Louisville metropolitan area, the bridge that crosses over. There you see the Falls of the Ohio State Park. Now the Falls of the Ohio is unique in the world except for one site in South Africa in terms of being a Devonian fossil bed. It's exposed. You can walk out on it, look at the fossils. So 280 million years of history right here. And they've got a fantastic interpretive center and it's an absolutely unique site. These islands out in the Ohio are the two smaller ones are actually wildlife refuges that are managed by the Corps of Engineers. So that's also unique in the country. Then you see Jeffersonville, town of about 35,000 people that, as I said, has really benefited from the walking bridge and is rapidly growing. Next town over is Clarksville, which, as I said, is our public-private partnership main partner, and they are extremely supportive of the park. And we're working with them to not just make the park, but the area around the park more multimodal, more pedestrian and bike friendly. So we're doing some road extensions that are going to be really good examples of complete streets projects. You can see the site itself. The greenway that I mentioned runs along the edge of it, right along the riverfront. And then you can see our plan that includes two creeks, one very small one that's kind of meandering, and then one that's at the very bottom, Silver Creek, which is a much larger body of water. And then next over, you have the town of New Albany. This is what the Falls of the Ohio looks like. So as I said, a truly unique, really amazing site. And this is very close to our park, and we'll be kind of part of a chain of really fantastic sites along the river. This is the Greenway, which links the Big Four Bridge from Louisville with the Jeffersonville, New Albany. And this has proven to be really transformative with recreational cycling and walking, but also with some utility cycling. You will see some commuters along this way. There was really no way to safely get by bike from point A to point B until this was built. And it's really been transformative for the area. And that's going to be a part of our park as well. So if you take a look at the map from above, our site currently is kind of a dark spot in a loop of parks and greenways and urban and suburban communities. It is currently brownfield, overgrown former agricultural sites, borrow pits from freeway construction in the 60s, and some other unfortunate uses. But we also have some incredible biodiversity and some truly beautiful spaces. Just to give you a sense of how we fit into the rest of the green infrastructure in the metropolitan area, we call ourselves the clasp and the emerald necklace. The inner ring, of course, is Waterfront Park and Origin Park. So these are the parks right along the Ohio River. Then the next ring out are the Olmsted Parks. So Olmsted's firm was here from the 1870s up until the 1930s, with, of course, his sons finishing the rest of the work after he passed away. So we have an amazing Olmsted hub and spoke system. And then this outer ring includes Jefferson Memorial Forest, which is the largest urban forest in the United States, the parklands of Floyd's Fork, which is a relatively new and mostly privately funded linear park system, and the Louisville Loop, which is an incomplete 100-mile loop around the metropolitan area. Again, just a reference to how unusual and how interesting this site is. We are only one of two sites in the country with a river in an urban area that has Class 4 rapids owing to the Falls of the Ohio, and 2 miles of non-commercial traffic. We have our 2 creeks that flow in, and one of which is going to become a paddling blueway as of April. We have these fantastic river islands that are really amazing. The fossil beds. So again, this is a site that's pretty unmatched. So One thing about our park that makes it really unusual is it is designed to be resilient to flooding. So it's Olin Landscape Architects that we're working with is creating a climate adaptive park. The yellow line that you see here is the flood wall. In 1937, the worst Ohio River flood in history covered 60% of the city of Louisville, 65 square miles of Jefferson County, which is what it's in, and damages totaled more than $1 billion in today's dollars. The entire town of Clarksville was inundated and had to be rebuilt, which is part of why you don't see a historic core in Clarksville. And then the flood walls were put in place to protect against future such catastrophes. So our park is going to be designed to withstand flooding and to be visited during floods. So we're hoping that we will not have to close most of the year when we have our seasonal floods that are becoming more frequent and unfortunately more severe. We also are planting many species of trees that are actually flood dependent for survival. And we're going to have elevated walkways and boardwalks that can be used when the water is high. I'll have more about that in a little bit. So as I said, our park would not exist without all of our supportive partnerships. All of these organizations have been core to helping us get resources, acquire land, do our brownfield remediations, fundraise, all the important things that we're doing right now. We're also working with an excellent design team. Olin, as I said, an internationally renowned firm with a very long history of making ecological sensitive places that also embrace community needs. And we're working with Joseph and Joseph Bravura Architects, which has a century-long history of designing in the Louisville area. So before we go into the park of the future, let's go back into the land of the past a little bit. This place has a lot of stories. The reason there's a lot of history here is the Falls of the Ohio. It's the only real navigational obstacle on the nearly 1,000 miles of the Ohio River. The land where Origin Park is being created started to develop more than 380 million years ago. You can see that with the fossil beds that I mentioned. After the glaciers and waters were treated, it was home to different indigenous tribes for about 10,000 years, primarily Shawnee, Miami, Illinois, and other tribes were here. We had bison roaming North America, millions of them, until they nearly became extinct in the 1800s. And this place was once home to vast herds of them, although we persist in calling them buffalo for reasons I don't understand. Moving to more modern times, George Rogers Clark founded Clarksville in 1783, and Clarksville became the first settlement in the Northwest Territory. This is where the Lewis and Clark expedition started. And the history of the park also includes a role in the Underground Railroad. This was a crossing from Kentucky, which is a slaveholding state. There were some slaves held illegally in Indiana also, but this was also the site of a lot of escapes on the Underground Railroad, and then the first Black settlement in the area called Guinea Bottoms. So our park is directly under the Mississippi Flyway, which has more than 325 bird species making the round trip every year from their breeding grounds in Canada and then back. We've done a lot of biodiversity studies in the park. These are all available on our website, but we know there are species that we haven't seen yet. We always try to encourage visitors to use citizen science projects like iNaturalist to help build our knowledge. So back to the plan, and then to talk more about the design. So this is a 430-acre total site. We have a 3-phase master plan for it. We have plans for biodiverse woodlands, trails, renaturalization of one creek, the activation of another as a blueway, rehabilitated quarry ponds, low woodlands that will regularly flood, open lawns, and lots of bridges and elevated walkways. So restoring these habitats will include planting 75,000 new trees, which will absorb about 3,000 tons of carbon annually. These trees depend on seasonal flooding like silver maple and cottonwood, and we're eventually going to sustain 200 acres of urban forest plus 50 acres of lowland wetwoods, 150 acres of meadows, 22 miles of public trails, 4.5 miles of blueway, and 1.5 miles of restored creek channels from former agricultural use. Just to look at these aerial photos to acquaint you with what the site looks like now and the nature of the landscape. So this has a lot of different landscape types on the site, but these are 2 general conditions. So towards the river, we have what's called emergent lowlands. This is generally elevation of 430 feet or below. These are frequently flooded bottomlands within the floodplain. They include some remnant stream channels and former agricultural fields and borrow pits. And a lot of these are dominated by cottonwood and silver maple, and also some more unique plant communities like the sedge meadows that are located in Buttonbush Woods. These are relatively rare in the Louisville region as habitats, so they're of conservation significance, even though they're relatively young. And then we have disturbed uplands, which are usually above 430 in elevation. These are less frequently flooded. And they include seeded meadows, minimally maintained lawns, and also large areas of currently unvegetated bare soil and some eroding pavement. So this project is a really incredible opportunity to transform a really scarred urban site that's endured a lot of generations of pollution, deforestation, intensive use. This is a fairly recent photograph, so this is what a lot of the site looks like. And you know, brownfields are a really significant issue in land use planning. The EPA estimates that 58 million people live within a mile of one. Naturally, this disproportionately impacts poorer communities and communities of color. And because of unchecked retail and residential sprawl in a lot of urban and peri-urban areas, there is less and less land left available in communities to create much needed green spaces. The decline of a lot of industries in the last few decades has left a lot of abandoned sites. So adaptive reuse is only going to become more important. So while this kind of work, reclaiming an industrial site, is incredibly hard work, it's incredibly expensive. It's got so many challenges and so many legal and bureaucratic and environmental barriers to success, but it has to be done because, you know, we have to find ways to reuse this land and turn it into something great for the community. So we think this project is going to be a model and an inspiration for other communities in our region and across the country. Just some images of what happens here during floods. There was an Army Corps of Engineers report from 2017 that predicted that in the near future, there are going to be more potent storms that are going to cause river levels to surge, risking major floods. There's going to be more frequent and heavier droughts, rising temperatures and wild swings in river flows, economic losses that could be 10 times greater than any other resource-based threats. So we're looking at some serious changes, and our park has to be climate adaptive and has to respond to that if it's going to have a future. You know, when you design a park, you don't design for now, you design for 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And that's definitely the sort of scenario-based thinking that we're using in planning this park. Part of making the case for the park involves looking at the neighborhoods directly around it. And it's not surprising, this data, it's from the census. And on the Indiana side, there are a lot of possible or high poverty areas, especially on the other side of the river in predominantly Black West Louisville. And we are the closest large nature space to most of West Louisville. There's a lot of small kind of sports and recreational facilities in the area, but to get to a real nature experience, which, as we know, is very different from being in a small park with a basketball court and a baseball diamond. We need both, but there's no real nature experience near some of these neighborhoods. And so what we're hoping to give people is a connection to their environment. So that's where we are now. And then a little bit about where we're going. How are we for time? So this is where we are now with our land acquisition. So a total planned of 430 acres. We now have everything that we need for phase one, which is the area that we're really focusing on now. And we have most of what we need for our entire master plan for the entire 430 acres. We are focusing now on making phase one happen so that we can activate the park, which we think will leverage enough excitement and resources to accelerate the completion of the other phases. Our director of operations just yesterday was ecstatic because a couple more of those buildings just got knocked down. That's what it takes to make us happy, is getting rid of the old so we can bring in the new. There's been really a lot of extensive research and study that's gone into this project. We had a really extensive economic impact study to show just how much prosperity this park would bring because of, you know, using comparisons from other cities and looking at what an impact a park has. Something I haven't talked about a lot because it's way down the road with our master plan, but we are planning on having, in addition to the open, free public park spaces, we are going to have a whitewater adventure center that's going to be a paying facility that will help support the free public park. So focusing in on phase one, this is underway for completion in 2026. So it starts this year. We have a budget for this phase of about $32 million, 23 million of which we've already raised through public and private resources. This is 141 acres. Now, this does include, if you look over to the left of the screen, you'll see Silver Creek and you'll see a road leading to it. That is the Blue Way, which we are activating starting in April with the official public opening of the launch that we just constructed there. That's going to be free for use. And we're going to have a little ribbon cutting celebration for it. So you can see that it's disconnected from phase one's footprint, but it is part of it and it's connected by that road. Then another important part of it is the Mill Creek and Buttonbush Woods restoration, which is a beautiful biodiverse woodland that I'm going to show you some images of. We've got an events center, which is going to be also a revenue stream, a river arts house, which will be a place for artists and residents, a ravine bridge that connects the two, and the upper way, which is an elevated way that'll be usable even during the floods. So this is what these are all renderings from our architecture and landscape architecture team. So this is, as I mentioned, Joseph and Joseph Architects, which is a local firm that's been working in Louisville for about a century. And they just finished construction of this, but this is a rendering of it, but it is now finished and ready to go. And this is a really nice opportunity for beginner level paddling. The Ohio can be a little bit daunting when it comes to paddling. You kind of have to know what you're doing. So this is a nice calm creek that flows out into the river. You can paddle up and down it. It's not even hard to paddle upstream. So it's a nice welcoming place for beginning paddlers, but you can also go out into the river if you want to be a little more adventurous. This is a shot I took during the winter flood. So the construction is already finished. As I said, we're going to have a little ceremony to open it to the public in April. And then we're going to have a big fun public event in June where we'll paddle across the river to an Olmsted Design Park that's in West Louisville on the other side of the river. And this creek is really beautiful and scenic, especially in the warmer months. It's also got some interesting human history. There's a beautiful old rail bridge from around 1905 that's disused, but people use it for mountain biking trips, which is fun. So people can put in at this location and take out if they want to, or if they have two vehicles and they want to put in at this location, we have another one located about 4.5 miles upstream. Now we move down into the core of phase one, into our event center. This is going to be a focal point of the park and a means towards financial self-support. That's also going to offer economic opportunity to local businesses like caterers and events planners, as we have conferences and workshops and weddings and all kinds of events there. The event center is going to feature some really beautiful gardens with native perennials. So we want to model good ecological practices and show homeowners that they don't need to have their lawn. They can have a beautiful native garden, and it works and it looks nice and it's easy to maintain. So here's what the space looks like. This is Olin's rendering of it. And it's going to provide space for indoor and outdoor gatherings. It's meant to have views of the river that are really beautiful. It's going to be the arrival point for park visitors to phase one. So this will be the first impression that most people get of the park when they come in on the multimodal road that's going to lead to it. It's close to a new Upper Way route that is going to be an alternative to the Ohio Greenway during flooding. It's going to have a living room, a small meeting room. It's going to be big enough for 350 people. So we're hoping that this will be a place where we can have kind of an artful combination of free public programming, but also paying events that will allow us to be eventually self-supporting, or at least be part of our self-supporting model for River Heritage Conservancy. The design really puts the landscape first. It's kind of meant to dissolve into the landscape. And it's also got very sensitively done design that maximizes the natural environment and minimizes how much we need to use artificial heating and cooling, which is really important, obviously. There's going to be an open air pavilion with an outdoor venue. You can see here we have the renderings of the perennial gardens and some of the flowering trees. And here you can see the framing of an old railroad bridge and the river. The event center is on an interesting site. It's used to be an apple orchard, and during the First and Second World Wars, paddlefish had their caviar harvested here because Russian caviar was not available because of the war. And so they decided that paddlefish would be a good alternative to sturgeon. Again, if you don't know what a paddlefish is, do look it up because they're pretty amazing. This is called the Ravine Bridge, and it's inspired by the local forest landscape, and it has lots of abundant openings, seating, and views out to the river and the surrounding landscape. This is going to be a favorite place for people to bike, bird watch, socialize, do all kinds of things. And this offers a quick, accessible connection between the River Arts House, which I'm going to show you in a moment, and the event center, because there's kind of a rugged drop-off between the two in the topography. So this is the River Arts House, kind of similarly inspired architectural design, and it's meant to be a space where our offices eventually are going to be, which I can tell you I'm really looking forward to. And we're also going to have community programs and a place for an artist in residence. It's inspired by a vernacular architecture from this region called the Dog Trot House. And these are usually characterized by a big open breezeway that runs through the middle of two separate living areas. They're thought to have originated in the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky in the 1800s. It's a very functional design that also serves as a very beautiful place with a lot of natural light that, again, really takes advantage of the natural climate and requires minimum heating and cooling. This is the Upper Way. So we plan on being a national leader in green space design, in that our place is designed to withstand and even be used during floods. And the Upper Way is kind of a key element of this. It's got this really cool sort of stripped down industrial design to it. And even when it's not flooded, this is going to be a really thrilling place to bike and walk. And we think this is going to be one of the most prominent elements in the park. Then down to Buttonbush Woods. This is going to be a favorite place for hiking and birding. It's very diverse. It has Mill Creek, this beautiful little creek running through it that has some pretty extensive beaver activity going on. This creek is going to get renaturalized. It cuts very deep. It's gotten a lot of abuse over the years, lost a lot of its shoreline vegetation. So this is going to be kind of a massive renaturalization project to really bring this creek back to its best self. It's going to be a beautiful place for kind of quiet contemplation, really enjoying nature on one's own level in kind of a meditative way. Also, there's going to be a trail system back there. And the trail system is interesting because it combines the natural and the human history of the park, in that a lot of the trails are along the contours of old flood levees back from when these lands were farms. It's named Buttonbush Woods for the native wetland shrub that is useful as well as beautiful. It's a plant that's highly effective at restoring wetlands, controlling erosion, and creating thriving wildlife habitats. So we'll be renaturalizing the creek, altering its creek bed and its banks, restoring its vegetation, and adding some elements that will slow it down and make for a natural meandering waterway. So I said, this is also a great place to see the work of some of nature's greatest engineers, of course, the beavers. And there's going to be some fully accessible boardwalks that can get people through here. And these are some fairly recent photographs, so this is what it looks like now. And the map shows there's a lot of interesting little remnants of when it was a farm. So you can see things marked on it like farm levees, but also an old farm truck that's slowly being consumed by nature. The seat's all covered with moss and lichens. There's an old culvert that we're hoping to be able to remove to improve the creek ecology. And then this is a future image of, or this is a future rendering of another phase that's going to come after phase one. So this is not part of this first phase that we're focused on now, but this is just an example of some of the other parts of the park. This is called the Infinity Loop, a 2.8-mile cycle and pedestrian circuit that'll take people out over the water and really frame the beautiful views and the architecture of the city. This is way in the future, but this is kind of one of the most exciting parts about the park's plan, which is the Whitewater Adventure Center. This is using an old quarry pond and turning it into a place where people can experience kayaking, zip lining, rock climbing, all sorts of things. And as I said, this is going to be eventually the park's revenue generator so that River Heritage Conservancy can be a self-supporting organization. And Also, one of the reasons that we have a name that's a separate brand from the park itself is we hope that once Origin Park is up and operational, we'll be able to look at other projects that connect people better to the river as well. But that's quite a ways in the future. Offer recreations of all kinds for those who want to meditate, search for wildlife, all to connect with nature in their own ways. So our 9 goals with Origin Park are to positively shape our region's trajectory for generations to come through excellence in design, stewardship, and visitor experience, consistently deliver a beautiful park for everyone, all 12 months of the year, build park amenities around what most people do when they visit a park: walk, run, bike, socialize, gather with family, and shape a landscape that celebrates the stars of our community, which of course are native plants and wildlife. And we also hope to honor the rich and diverse cultures that have walked across this landscape for the thousands of years that it's been inhabited, and also celebrate the wildness and the raw beauty of the Ohio River. So we hope to be an incredible source of nature experiences to our neighbors, but also to the region as well. We think this is going to be a transformative effect on regional tourism. We have studies that project that this park is going to have a massive impact on our local environment in terms of being able to attract new talent, to attract families to the area, to improve property values, improve quality of life, health outcomes, spending in adjacent downtowns, which are all 3 of these communities, Jeffersonville, Clarksville, and New Albany, all have really hopping downtowns with a lot going on. Clarksville happens to be new, but all 3 of these communities have really put a lot in the last several years into having vibrant, thriving downtowns with lots of businesses that really attract people, which wasn't always the case. So we're hoping that this park will just continue to amplify and accelerate that process. So we think Origin Park is going to provide recreational, educational, and community building opportunities that are unequaled in any city along the Ohio River's journey. It's where our shared future begins. And we think it's going to be the place where people will reconnect with nature, discover astounding stories, improve their health, strengthen their ties with each other, and its beauty and innovation will be a beacon that inspires everyone in our region and beyond. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wow, thanks so much, Kristen. What an incredible project. Yeah, this is I don't know if other people are feeling this way, but every time you mentioned the details of the plans, I feel inspired and in awe of like what a big undertaking and what huge impact this will have. That's really exciting. So one question, so you talked kind of early about the design of the flood wall around the park.
Mm-hmm.
Curious, what does the design of that flood wall like what's the impact with the surrounding neighborhoods, and sort of like what, just like what goes into thinking about I assume, based on what it looks like, sort of protecting the park and thereby to some degree protecting the neighborhoods, but maybe does it mean, like, what does it mean for the neighborhoods around?
The flood wall or the park?
The flood wall.
The flood wall went up in 1937.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah,
wonderful.
I'm sorry, I speak really fast, so it's hard to. Yeah, the flood wall went. So there was a historic flood in 1937 that covered most of the metropolitan area, and that was when the flood wall went up. So a lot of it is still, not all of it is still up, but a lot of it is still up. Some of the levee has cycling infrastructure on it now, but so we think the park, in terms of impacting the community around it, is going to be obviously very positive, because we're getting. We're not just creating a park, we're getting rid of a lot of really harmful landscapes like these junkyards and landfills and so on. So it's going to be, much better in terms of absorbing floods. We're going to get rid of all these toxic sites. We are, I think there's a question about phytoremediation. Yeah, that is touched on and mentioned quite a lot in our landscape architecture firm's plan. We're still in the early phases of this park, so there are some questions that I don't have great answers to, because we're still developing a lot of the ideas, and because so much of it, something like about half of the park is brownfield. And just to give an example, I don't know, how many of you all have experience with brownfield reclamations and just how long they take. Fresh Kills Park in New York, which used to be a landfill, and that's a 30-year plan, and that's bigger than this, but it's kind of, I think it's a comparable site, 30 years, and that's the optimistic view. We have a beautiful botanical garden that just opened here in Louisville that was also a dump. That was something like 12 years, and it's 25 acres. So it's a huge challenge, and there's a lot that we don't yet know. For example, the landfill is one of the most complicated to address.
And I think you mentioned several of the facilities that are going to be built there. I assume that there will be public restrooms incorporated to that. So for folks
Yes.
who are visiting the park, that was one of the questions: is if there will be restroom facilities available for visitors.
Yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, you can't expect to have a park of any size and not provide people with that very basic. Fishing. Yeah. Yeah, of course. And I mean, people can freely fish in the Ohio. They can fish in the creek. Yeah. Absolutely. The gathering place, tell me about that. That sounds kind of familiar, Russ.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so yeah, it's a 65-acre park in Tulsa that has a lot of the same type of amenities that I think you're thinking of incorporating to yours. So I encourage you to click on that link and take a look, and you may find some synergy there, looking at what they're doing, and you might even want to contact the folks that built that park and say, okay, what worked, what didn't work? Help us avoid some mistakes that we'd like to avoid from your experience.
Yeah, I'm always all about learning from other people's mistakes. I'm really in favor of that.
It's one of the benefits of sharing information, is that we all get better and learn more as we share more.
Yeah.
So another question is, how have Indigenous communities been consulted with or incorporated into this project?
Yeah, so we have had consultations. We also have had archaeological research that's being done. So there are some sites on our property. I don't have extensive knowledge of that because that hasn't been something that I've been extensively involved with, but I'd be happy to ask my colleague who is in charge of operations, who would be able to provide details on that if you send me your email.
Great, thanks.
How does this sort of undertaking get funded? So for brownfield reclamation, you don't get funding from many people besides the EPA, because no funder wants to have a brownfield name for them. Yes, it is. It is being done with Native and Indigenous people as partners. So our, yeah, I have to ask my colleague who has been a lot more engaged with that. I apologize if I don't have a good answer for that question, but I can get that if anybody who wants to know that, provide me with your email address, or you can look at my, my email is on the conference website, and I'd be happy to look into that in more detail. So how does this get funded? So we have some EPA funds. We are also looking at some other federal grants. We have some Louisville foundations that have supported us. It's a bit of a challenge because a lot of Indiana resources want to fund things around Indianapolis or up by the Chicago area. A lot of Louisville funders want to fund things on the other side of the river. So that's been a challenge for us, but we do have a lot of support. We have a lot of support from the town of Clarksville. Community foundations have given us funds. So it's been a combination of public and private.
That's great. So 75,000 new trees.
Yeah, that's
an incredible number. What's I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about the plan for what that kind of an installation and maintenance plan looks like in terms of the amount, both of the amount of disturbance, or, you know, if there's a plan for sort of like bringing new soil in areas, what, you know, just, yeah, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so what we're hoping to do is get rid of invasives. So we have a pretty extensive invasive species removal, but we're also looking to the local office of the USDA to help us with kind of a more elaborate site-specific plan. Our landscape architects have done quite a lot of work in that already, because as I mentioned, there's a whole long list of invasive species that sort of took advantage of the poor condition of the site. And then, yeah, it's going to be a very gradual planting plan. Our master plan stretches out over about 20 years. There's going to be a lot of renaturalization of meadows. We want to have open areas for people to be, but minimum mowing requirements and use of native species to the absolute extent possible, pretty much entirely.
Great. You mentioned at some point you mentioned that that parks like this and hopefully this park in particular will bring prosperity to the surrounding communities. What are Clarksville and New Albany maybe in particular, like what are they thinking, and how are people feeling about the, it's like there's always this question of like bringing such a wonderful amenity to a community. It increases spending and increases housing prices, and yeah, I'm just curious what the conversation's like with the communities and how people who are living there now may be impacted, and that being sort of planned for throughout the process.
So we have, originally we were partners with New Albany as well as Clarksville, but New Albany has kind of decided they want to do their own thing with the lands along Silver Creek. So that original master plan no longer includes the land west of Silver Creek. Clarksville has been a very supportive partner. We meet regularly with their town manager. They've been very supportive of the park. They consider very much, their project as well as ours. They've helped us with getting funding. We're going in together on some big federal grants. So I think their feeling is that it's only going to improve the area around the park. And what we're also hoping, is that the improvement of the roadways into the park, and you can really only get these big federal grants if you promise to do it right and do, cycling infrastructure and safe crosswalks and so on, and traffic calming and road diet and all the good measures. We're hoping that it'll change the modal share in Clarksville, that, it'll impact how people not only get to the park, but get around their neighborhoods, because the neighborhoods around the park are very fragmented by large high-speed boulevards. So they're little neighborhoods with very small scale streets with fast streets connecting them. So there's a lot of disconnection in the town. But we're hoping the park will actually impact that too. So I've got roof surfaces on the buildings proposed for this park. Any opportunity to generate electricity on those roofs? We haven't gotten to that point in the conversation yet, but I think that's something that we should consider personally. I know that the architects, as I said, have been very careful to design it in a way that takes advantage of natural air currents and minimizes the need for electricity and heating and cooling. Yeah, car charging stations, that's probably fundable too. Yeah, Robert Moses, exactly. But we were looking at criteria for a federal grant, and it's great that if you go after these federal grants, they make you do the right thing. So they want to know how it's going to impact pollution on underserved communities. They want to know how it's going to change modal split. They want to know how it's going to reduce accidents. You can't just ask for, these kinds of monies and just want to build a road again, which is great because it's really the way we need to go.
Let's see, another question: has the recent disaster in East Palestine caused your team to adjust any of the plans for Origin Park?
Not yet. I think the news is too fresh, and I don't know about you. When they say, "Oh, there's nothing to worry about here," I don't really agree with them. I liked white noise better as fiction, to be honest. But yeah, it's very frightening. So we're kind of waiting to see what happens there.
Are there any compromises that you all are thinking about down the road? Like sometimes in big projects, there's a vision, there's a plan, and then depending on whatever various factors, funding or collaborators, things sort of have to get there's some decisions that need to be made about like what things will be included and what won't. Is that something like that the sort of vision of the park has like your sort of must-haves or things that down the road you may decide, well, maybe this is just takes longer to get this particular aspect, or are there things that, yeah, just things that you're thinking about might not be included later?
So we've already had many of those. We started this project back in 2016. I've only been with this organization since October, by the way. So this is why I don't know everything that I should. But we already, altered our partnership with New Albany to no longer, have that as part of our alliance, which caused the footprint of the park to shrink. We obviously had some of the same challenges that everybody had during COVID with supply chain and things taking longer than they should. With brownfields, you inevitably are going to have surprises in, what's in the ground. So yeah, we've already had to modify and change timelines and change the footprint of the park. Our priority is getting phase 1 up and running so we get people in the park and start serving our public. That's what we're really aiming at now. So rather than spreading thin and trying to open a lot more of it at once, we're really focusing on that little core element, especially since it has the revenue generator of the event center, which means we can, start on our way to being self-supportive. So what we really want to do is get people into the park and enjoying, beautiful free recreation.
Excellent.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. I'll look that up. Yeah, I'm really, I find phytoremediation a really fascinating topic, and mycoremediation, I guess, using mushrooms to remove toxins. I'd like to learn more about that.
Well, I think we have answered all of the questions that have been raised, but if there are any other questions from the group, please feel free to type them in the chat, or go ahead and unmute yourself. We still have a couple of minutes before the session technically ends, or if there's anything else that you want to talk about, Kristen, about the project in the park that you didn't get to talk about before, feel free.
I don't think there's anything that I didn't touch on. It is just a really fascinating site because of the uniqueness of it. And then when you look at just think with riverfronts in general, it's amazing to me how long we thought of them as just kind of a functional, utilitarian, industrial space, and just how much we've cut ourselves off from the river. I grew up here, and then I lived in Hungary for a long time. So I've always lived in a place with a river. It just was the Danube for a while. And then when I was in Portland, it was the Willamette and the Columbia, and now it's the Ohio again. And it just amazes me when we don't think of our riverfront as one of the most precious assets that we have. So it's a very satisfying project to be working on, to know that we're helping reconnect people to the river in a place that's been disconnected for so long.
Yeah, that's so great. I mean, it's you see it all over where places there. We decided that the best place to put the highway was right next to the river, and now there's no access to it, or the access is really difficult. And now the parks and green spaces that are created, which are certainly wonderful to have, there's still this existing tension then against, okay, well, I'm in this green space, but it's right next to a big road, and what does that mean, and how do you get access to it?
Yeah, putting your name on a brownfield is, no, people want to fund a finished product. I mean, I think in an ideal world, yeah, people would get excited about having their name on a brownfield, but yeah, maybe it's just a matter of spin. And something else we're really interested in drilling down more on, when we talk about this being a climate adaptive park, it's because, we're planting things that can withstand floods, and we're building elevated walkways, but we want to, in the coming years, drill down on that concept a lot more. What does it really mean to be climate adaptive, and how does our park impact the climate resilience of the community around it? It's an interesting message to try to share in a part of the country that is pretty conservative. We have our share of people here who don't really believe that that's happening, or don't think that we can do anything about it. So it becomes a really important part of our messaging. And we're lucky enough to have an intern this summer who's going to be researching that for us and trying to, get some data about what this park is going to do in terms of, and what are the metrics and the measurables in terms of it being climate adaptive.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
well,
yeah, talking with, certainly convincing people that what you're doing is a benefit to them when they don't agree with some of the core principles of the project. Certainly that's can be really challenging. So yeah, good luck to you and your team on that research and communication.
But I mean, people in the community are excited about having a new park. And I think the way you bring people over into that message is you give them a place that they love and you make them care about it and be connected to it. And then, to care about it and feel a sense of connection and responsibility and stewardship. And then maybe it makes that messaging a little bit easier when it's connected to a place they love. I believe that. Janine, beavers, what other animals? Well, we were in the woods the other day and saw a hawk and an owl, and they looked pretty prosperous. So there's a lot of critters out there that are part of their food web for sure. And we think we have about 100 species of birds living in the park at various times of the year.
That's great. Well, and certainly all of that forest and all of that edge habitat will surely draw more and create so much more habitat.
Yeah. Yeah, we hope so too. Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here, and I will move over to the garden now.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
So welcome and thank you for joining us today for the third session in the relationships with the land track of the 29th annual ELA conference. My name is Sandra. I serve on the board of directors and I'll be your host for this session. Once again, if your current situation permits, we encourage you to go on camera for the session so that we can all get to know each other better and foster an interactive learning community. We're sure you'll enjoy hearing from today's presenter, Enrique Salmon. We especially want to thank our sponsors for this year's conference. We encourage you to visit their rooms and ask them questions regarding their services and their products. So thank you to Pleasant Run Nursery, Understanding Ag, Soil Health Academy, TickSuit, and Ernst Seeds. Please stop by our sponsors during breaks, ask your questions, set up appointments, and visit them to thank them. Additionally, we want to point you to a few housekeeping notes to ensure that you have the best experience possible. Feel free to post your questions in the chat as they come up. You're invited to join us in the Track 2 Speaker Garden after this session for further opportunities to explore your questions more fully with our speaker and others. If you need CEUs, the tabs are in the main space and they provide you with detailed instructions on what's required and what you'll need to do to ensure you receive your CEUs from the provider. If you haven't filled out your profile as an attendee and are using this Kiko platform, please do so. Just go ahead and find your name on the top right of the browser page and edit your profile. We want to not only see where everyone hails from, but we're hosting networking lounges identified by region later this afternoon as a way of encouraging attendees to mix and mingle with colleagues in your region. So we hope you will take advantage of opportunities for meeting others in person, online, and take advantage of it all. To, again, edit your profile, go to the conference space on your browser, click on your name located on the top right of the corner, and then click Edit Profile. But if you've got any questions about using the space, don't hesitate to ask or post it in the chat. We'll take care of you in the chat. And we also have somebody who's monitoring the chat for these kinds of questions as soon as possible. One more little detail. Don't forget, if you have a job opening or are interested in jobs, there's a tab in the main space listing called Job Openings and Possibilities. You're encouraged to post both job openings and seek opportunities. And then finally, of special note, if you haven't done so, there's still time to register and sign up for tonight's keynote session with Nancy Lawson, and you'll surely enjoy it. So please do register for the keynote session. All right. Now on to the session. We are sure you're here to listen to our presenter today, Dr. Enrique Salmon. Enrique Salmon is author of Eating the Landscape, a book focused on small-scale native farmers of the Greater Southwest and their role in maintaining biocultural diversity. He has also recently published Iwigara, The Kinship of Plants and People, an ethnobotany of 80 plants important to American Indians. Enrique holds a PhD in anthropology from Arizona State University. His dissertation was a study of how the bioregion of the Raramuri people of the Sierra Madres of Chihuahua, Mexico, influences their language and thought. Enrique has been a scholar in residence at the Heard Museum, on the board of directors of the Society of Ethnobiology, and has published several articles and chapters on indigenous ethnobotany, agriculture, nutrition, and traditional ecological knowledge. He teaches American Indian Studies in the Department of Ethnic Studies at Cal State University East Bay. He is also the campus tribal liaison and NAGPRA coordinator. Perhaps that's short for NAGPRA. Thank you. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Enrique Salmon.
Thank you very much. Wiraba, nehe taripa mechomari, nehe raramori, nehe rahipala, Chochenyo Oloni, Sunu Utu. I'm Enrique Salmon, and I'm speaking to you from Chochenyo Oloni country over here in the Bay Area of California. I am Raramuri, that's my people, my tribe. There's about 70,000 of us. We live down in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico, in and around a canyon that's bigger and deeper than the Grand Canyon. If you've never been there, you should go. There's a beautiful train ride to go check out the place. Some of my pictures I'll be showing are from the area there. And I want to thank the ELA, the Ecological Landscape Alliance, for inviting me to do this talk. They seem like incredible people. We had a meeting a while ago and I got to meet some of the other speakers, and I wish this was in person. I have a feeling that I would be making a lot of new friends from all the people that were gathered online anyway. Seem like wonderful people. So I'm going to switch screens a little bit here and show you some images. Hopefully it works. That will be connected to my talk here. And let's see. There we go. So as I was mentioned earlier, I'm a professor of American Indian Studies at California State University East Bay, and I'm the NAGPRA coordinator. That's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and so I do a lot of that kind of work. But really, I'm an ethnoecologist, and that's a lot of what I teach in our department. And it's been this amazing journey trying to figure out how, as an Indigenous scholar, as a Native person, to more easily and readily, better able to translate what I, as a Native person, other Native peoples know into language that non-Native people will understand with regards to our relationship to land, to water, to air, to all living things around us. As you see here, one of the first Native peoples to try to accomplish this was Pueblo scholar Gregory Cajete. He's a retired professor now at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And he started to write before 1993, but in 1993, he published the book Native Science. And that was one of the first formal entries into this study of trying to introduce, from an Indigenous perspective, our worldview, our relationship to place. And because I have a long friendship with Gregory, we shared a lot of ideas. So finally, by 2000, I published an article for the Ecological Society of America, and it was focused on this notion that I'm going to introduce in a minute: concentric ecology, indigenous perceptions of the human-nature relationship. And so I'm hoping that as I go through this presentation, it'll really open up some more of these ideas for you and help you to maybe look at the way you do your work, especially in relationship to land and to the cultures that have resided and still reside on so much of these lands. For Native peoples in general, the land is a relative. It is directly related to us. And this isn't a metaphorical, metaphysical kind of relationship. This is, from our perspective, an actual relative, just like our human aunts and uncles. The plants, the animals, a lot of the rocks and so on, they are humans in another form. Or if you look at it the other way, we are plants in another form. We have a lot of phrases, metaphors in my language where that refer to, for example, how our teeth resemble the ears, or excuse me, the rows of the kernels in a corn cob. We keep our hair long because as it grows up straight and out, it resembles the tassels of corn. And there's other examples like that. And you will see these metaphors, these ways of talking about our relationship to place in story, in our song. You see it reflected in the ceremony, the regalia that we wear, the colors and so on. This is truly a concentric relationship to our landscapes. Concentric is an idea that another Native scholar friend of mine, Dennis Martinez, and I came up with years ago, where we were going back and forth with the question that I raised earlier. How can we as Native peoples, express what we know to non-Native thinkers and speakers? And we were talking about the core value, the core concept in our worldviews, that everything around us is related to us. And I can't remember which of us said it first, but it was like it's a kinship. And that's where I came up with this notion of concentric relationship and concentric ecology. Because of our relationship to place as a relative, we are very intimate with these places. We recognize the seasons. And remember, this is a result of sometimes 40, 100,000 years of being in connection to a place. And through oral traditions, oral literature, through our narrative, our songs, our stories, that knowledge is shared, has been shared for all those thousands of years. Compare an indigenous understanding of place to Western ecologists and botanists, for example, for thinking about plants. They've only been studying North America, in our case, for a little over 200 years. For my people, we've been doing it for 40,000 years in the same place. There's such deep ecological understandings that just only come from that deep, long, sophisticated and complex observation and being with a place. So that's why I mentioned the seasons, the personality of the land, living as a part of a place, and recognizing that the land remembers everything. And as a result, our morals, our values, our ideas of right and wrong sit on these lands. And over time, and still today, the land reminds us of proper behavior. How does it do that? Whenever I go by this one location in my homeland called Pahuachique, I can't help but look up at this tall hill and remember one of our origin stories, where these two children survived the flood. And I'm really shortening the story, but as a result, they introduced the next round of my people, Raramuri, and at the same time, a very important food plant to us, what we call sunu, which is corn. because we emerged from ears of corn. And corn is definitely, truly, in this sense, our mother. We're directly related to it and the land where this happened. So whenever I see that hill, the land reminds me of that sort of thing. As a result of this, all of our, I mentioned already, our ceremony, our regalia is a reflection of this deep understanding. One of our most important year-round rituals that we practice is known as Yumari. And like I say here, it's a concentric performance sort of art. And the dance itself, the ceremony itself, is a metaphor for our shared cognitive unconscious as Raramuri. To my people, beer, yes, a lot of people are going to love this. Beer, corn, and other elements contribute to a healthy landscape. And let me explain that for a second. Central to this ceremony, as you see in these buckets here, these 5-gallon plastic buckets, and traditionally we use these big clay oyas. And some villages still use the big giant clay oyas, big jars. Inside of these is this kind of beer made out of corn. It's a certain variety of corn that we grow because it's high in sugars and starches. And so we will grow this kind of corn and we make this beer and we drink this beer in just about every ceremony and gathering that happens among my people, because it's believed that the creator Onoruame likes the smell of our burps when we drink the beer. And when our creator smells that, it keeps the creator strong. The creator brings the rain, helps the flowers sprout into bloom, and keeps the animals healthy, makes the corn grow, and so on. And this ceremony is the only time you see the woman over here on the left side of this picture here. This is the only time where women in our society will dance. They will dance in this clockwise circle, going around the singers in the center there and around the corn beer and the offers of the tortillas and so on. And they'll dance and they represent the reproductive parts of flowers. And so this ceremony is just a recognition of our connection to place, our responsibility to make sure we perform these ceremonies, to make sure that our creation remains strong and healthy, and to make sure all of it continues. And these songs are a form of oral literature and that recognize our links to everything around us and to this ongoing sustenance. We believe that the creation didn't just happen once. It happened and is continuing. And so it's our role to make sure it continues by conducting ceremonies like this. And you hear similar expressions from other Native peoples all around North and South America. It's our responsibility to continue these dances, these songs, and it's directly connected to our identity and our beingness. To be Raramuri is to drink the beer, is to conduct these ceremonies. And so we see, as I've been mentioning these stories, these songs, examples like we see among other Native peoples. For those of you from the Pacific Northwest, perhaps, who are familiar with Pacific Northwest, you recognize some of the Native peoples from up there, like the Tlingit and the Haida, Snoqualmie, and so on. And their local ecology changes the way they reflect their relationship to place. It changes their stories. One of my favorite things I mentioned to my students is that indigenous knowledge, all indigenous ecological knowledge especially, is local. You can't really share it because the lands are so different all around where Native peoples are and have been. It's really, really difficult to be a traditional Apache in Vermont. The land is just so different. The plants are different. Everything is totally different. And so we go up to the Pacific Northwest, for example, and some of their ecological understandings comes through stories like their trickster stories, whose Raven is one of the main tricksters up there among the people in the Pacific Northwest. And Raven, in this case, has played a direct role in bringing the Tlingit to being, to their origins. Raven, as a trickster figure, has played a direct role in bringing the light for the Tlingit and Haida. Raven even brought the salmon to the people. And there are stories that reflect these understandings. And something else that's great about indigenous stories, people often wonder, well, how is the ecological knowledge shared through the generations? The stories. Because when you learn the stories, for example, the raven bringing the salmon story, there's these deep ecological understandings encoded and embedded in the stories. And if you listen to them over time, you realize that there's not just a single kind of salmon where the Haida are, or the Tlingit. There's 7 kinds of salmon, and they come up the rivers at 7 times in different times of the year. There's certain plants that will signal when the salmon are coming, and these ecological understandings are present in the stories. You just have to pay attention. For example, one of my favorite stories that reflects this understanding is a coyote story. And again, I'm going to shorten the story, but long story short, Coyote is drowning in this raging river, and the only way he can save himself is he reaches out to the bank of this river and he grabs onto this plant. And it's this strange looking plant. It looks like long green segmented straws with all these little striations going down, parallel wise down the plant. And it's kind of an ugly plant, but Coyote talks to the plant because he's still being pulled down the river, and he tells the plant, I will turn you into a beautiful, important, useful plant. Just help me get out of the river. And so the plant does that and digs its roots deeper, really, really deep. And Coyote is able to pull himself out of the river. And just like he promised, he turns the plant into this beautiful plant that we might know today as horsetail. And horsetail, if you ever tried to dig up horsetail, its roots are really, really deep. And where do you find horsetail? Wherever there's water or a damp earth. So that's just a simple example of how the coyote story can also impart ecological understandings and knowledge. And I want to go back to the end of this one here. So I mentioned these stories and so on. These play a direct role in indigenous understandings, and they're important for our cultural adaptations and our resilience. They play a deep and a direct role for why we're still here. And what do I mean by resilience? Well, I've often studied, and I teach a lot of this notion of what's called resilience theory. I've used it in my research a lot. If you've ever seen the book that was mentioned earlier, Eating the Landscape, half the book is really about resilience theory. And it's originally was created by people who study natural systems and then archaeologists trying to understand, as it says here, the source and role of change and the kinds of change that are transforming and lead to adaptive systems that are sustainable. And I spent a lot of time in the archives in Mexico City and in Sevilla in Spain, reading these 100-year-old Spanish archival materials, mostly written by Jesuit priests and so on. And I came across one that was written in 1767, and it was this 18-inch long page, all in old Castilian Spanish, with a list of indigenous communities that had disappeared by 1767. And I was looking through this list and was just blown away by how many there were. And just in Northwest Mexico, where this was focused on. So that's like the states of Chihuahua and Sinaloa and Sonora. And wondering at the same time, why are my people still here? Why are the Yaquis still here, and the Mayo and so on? In fact, I'm actually half Mayo and half Raramuri. My father's side of the family is Mayo, and my mother's side is Raramuri. We're matrilineal society, so our lineage goes through the mother's side. But wondering that to myself, and that's where I came across resilience, wondering what has caused my people to still be here. What kind of shocks did we absorb with the result of the Spanish entrada into our homeland? How did we learn from the shock as we go around this model here? And then how did we change, which is the release part, enough, just enough? In other words, how did we adapt and then change just enough so that we're still here? And that's, in essence, is resilience theory. And a part of this is this resilience results from adaptation that takes place in certain episodes where cultural capital builds up. What the heck is cultural capital? That's the elders who still carry on our traditions, who still tell the stories, who tell coyote stories and raven stories and so on. That's what's meant by cultural capital. And we have to have that, but at the same time, mixed with new ways of doing things. So the long-term memory loops are the traditions. That's like this bigger part of this figure 8 model here. And then the smaller part would be the new ways of doing things. That's the adaptations. By mixing those two, those are peoples that are still here. One example of an individual who represents his cultural capital is Eric Paninyamwa, who you see here in this picture. He's Hopi. And one of my Hopi elders, one of my Hopi best friends, and he was asked once in a talk that I hosted. After he got done with his talk, he was talking about Hopi agriculture out in northern Arizona, along the Colorado Plateau, where they're lucky to get 7 inches of rain a year. And someone asked him, why don't the Hopi just adopt irrigation? And his response was, if we used irrigation, we would no longer need the kachinas. And what he was trying to say is that we would have to give up our entire relationship to our landscape. We would have to change everything of what it means to be Hopi. We would have to change our entire land management system that actually avoids, this isn't the words that Eric used, but this is how we would translate it today. A land management system that avoids optimization of resources that's ultimately unsustainable. In other words, irrigation over time is not sustainable in most cases. There are some examples where it can work, but for most native peoples, to irrigate unnaturally is a form of optimization of resources that over time is just not going to happen anymore. It's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to work anymore. And native peoples over those 40,000 years that I mentioned earlier have figured out, for the most cases, there are some examples where it hasn't always worked, but in most cases have figured out how to live and interact and manage sustainably in a resilient way their ecosystems. And when we've done this, we've actually enhanced the diversity of our places. It's not an accident that in 16 of the most biodiverse places in the world, you still find 16 of the most 25 most biodiverse places of the world, you still find native peoples who are carrying on their traditional land management practices. So in other words, we are keystone species in our homelands. Before I wrote that article in 2000, the one about concentric ecology, Dennis Martinez and I presented this idea at the Ecological Society of America conference in Sacramento. And a lot of people didn't like that idea when we mentioned, well, humans can be keystone species in their ecosystems, because modern ecology has pretty much eliminated human involvement in ecosystems, or when there is human involvement, it's in a negative kind of interaction. But for native peoples, our interaction is actually enhancing diversity for the most part. We're as important to the Sonoran Desert as our saguaros. We are as important to Northern California landscapes as are the redwoods up here. And oh, by the way, that was another elder from my tribe. And one of our traditional practices is making these baskets out of these pine needles that are 12 inches long. To certain species of pine that only grows down there, it's endemic. But here's Eric again out here in his cornfield. And I want to move on from what I was been talking about here and start to get into some examples of what I mean by this. So these practices and actions that I've been mentioning that are result from this concentric ecological relationships to place directly influence the choices we make on the landscapes. So here's one of Eric's cornfields. Now that is nearly full-grown Hopi corn. And you're probably thinking, wait a minute, corn should be 6, 7, 8 feet tall. Well, if you're in the middle of Indiana, yeah. But out in northern Arizona, where you get a different kind of soil system and you get 7 inches of rain maybe. One of the things you do as a Hopi agriculturalist is you plant your corn, a couple of steps away so that they're not competing for the little bit of moisture that's in the soil. And you plant your corn about 18 inches deep in this sandy soil. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more. So what you're seeing here, you're actually seeing a stalk of, you're actually seeing about 5 stalks of corn planted right next to each other so that they support each other when the winds come. And you're seeing half of the corn stalk is actually underground. And you notice that there's weeds growing and so on. I once took some students out there to do some service learning work with Eric on his cornfields. And he was telling the students, yeah, there's, go ahead and weed down in between the furrows here of the corn, but make sure you leave certain plants. And so I used the word weed. Well, what you're actually seeing here, some of these plants in and around the corn are to the Hopi and other native peoples useful plants. So in other words, for native peoples, what we would call weeds are actually useful plants with a lousy press agent. A lot of plants are very useful, and that we keep them in the ground because they support the structure underneath the surface of the soil. They actually help bring moisture and nutrients to the root systems of the corn. And when they reach maturity, they can be used for medicines, edible greens, and other things important too, in this case, the Hopi. And I use this word refugia when I'm talking about these, small scale indigenous agriculture. These are our habitats. Just like I say here, that due to environmental factors, life history, and human activities, which is important, reduce the impacts of catastrophic disturbance and form a haven for relic flora and fauna. And I'm going to get more into that in a second here. But going back to these practices that we employ, the low impact irrigation, soil maintenance that actually increases the moisture of the soil, brings nutrients to the soil, regulates actually the temperature of the soil, and improves nitrogen availability, and encourages species diversity. I mentioned that cornfield in Indiana a while ago. I once pulled off the road when I was driving in Indiana and looked through in the middle of a cornfield, and I got scared because I got out of my car, and there was incredible corn everywhere, 7-8 feet tall, but there were no bugs. There was no bird song. It was dead quiet. If you were to do the same thing in one of my people's cornfields or a Hopi cornfield, you would hear the birds. There would be bugs flying around everywhere. That's because there's diversity in these places, in and around the corn. And as a result, creating microhabitats that actually bring useful nutrients and insects, pollinators to all of these plants, and practicing non-till plantings. So in other words, you don't till up the soil, because when you till up the soil, you release the moisture, you expose it to the oxygen, to the air, which releases more nutrients in soil. By not doing this, you actually keep the moisture and nutrients in the soil and reducing erosion. And this is important for people on the Colorado Plateau in Arizona and other native peoples, especially in the greater Southwest, because climate change is affecting everything. This should be a spring that's 3 feet deep up on the Colorado Plateau in northern Arizona. But Eric and I walked out to it expecting to see, 3 feet of an old spring, and this was what we got. And because of climate change, because of the extractive industry actually impacting in a negative way the aquifer underneath the ground, springs like this are drying up. And I'm going to skip this because I'm going to run out of time before I know it. So I want to get to how do native peoples in an arid landscape like the Colorado Plateau actually take advantage of natural systems in order to make their agriculture work? Well, they take advantage of what I'm calling hydrologically advantaged fields. So you really can't see it that much in this photo, but look at, compare, if you were to actually take a reading of this area at the bottom right part of this corner of this photo, and then somehow you had a super sensitive instrument and you were able to walk up maybe like 100 yards towards the left and upper part of the photo, you would have walked up about 6 feet. And what I'm getting at here is that you're seeing some dried out Navajo corn stalks here that have already been harvested. And what happens is that whenever it does rain, and then this time of year when there's snows and rain and so on, the moisture will go into the ground and seep down, but make its natural way to, you guys all know, water naturally flows downhill. Then later on, starting in about 2 weeks from now, actually, the early corn will be planted. Then in April, there'll be a second planting. Then in May, there'll be a third planting, taking advantage of any late rainstorms that'll come that is going to percolate downhill a little bit. And that's just one example of native peoples actually working with what the land is offering instead of working against it. Modern agribusiness would flatten that piece of field. Using lasers. Native people use what the land is already giving them. It's just depressed just enough to hang on to the moisture. Here's a diagram of what I'm talking about here, and how this natural hydrologic system operates. This is kind of exaggerated, but it's the same idea. Where any kind of water, in this case, they're mentioning flood water, is going to flow down and then spread out. And then what you're seeing here, what you can't see on the top is these layers that's taking place in the soils of the Colorado Plateau. That's actually creating those little thin micro aquifers starting about 18 inches down. And that's why the Hopi, in this case, will plant their seeds 18 inches down approximately. And they'll do this with a planting stick. I have mine over here in the corner. I should have grabbed it earlier, but I mentioned no-till farming. So here's what it looks like. You take your planting stick, dig it, swirl it around. You got your bucket of your blue, looks like blue corn here. You put about 6 or 7 kernels in there. You cover it up loosely. You take a couple steps, boom, you do the same thing. And that's no-till planting. And resulting in that picture I showed you earlier of Eric's cornfield. And so those are just a couple of little examples of this kind of land management. And throughout North America, you see examples like that, and as resulting in incredible biological diversity, food diversity, and just scores, I say, or hundreds of pre-Columbian endemic food crops and semi-domesticates. What do I mean by that there? Well, there is, like I say here in this slide, a mosaic of endemic and sustainable agricultural practices and crops unique, as I mentioned earlier, to all these different regions around North and South America. There's tons of different kinds of corn and beans and squashes that are still being grown today that have become land races. When you go to the grocery store, a typical grocery store today, you have a choice of really just 2 kinds of corn. Maybe, if you're lucky, 3 kinds of beans. But when Columbus first showed up here, or in 1525, when Cabeza de Vaca got shipwrecked on the coast of Florida, and then he and his 3 companions started making their way west across the South, across Texas, a little corner of what today is New Mexico, and then making their way into Northwest Mexico, or what today is Northwest Mexico. He kept this incredible journal. And when you read the journal, he just continues to mention the abundance of foods that native peoples had available and were offering to the travelers. At this time, there were 400 kinds of beans being grown by native peoples, scores of corn, of maize. My people, we grow something like 24 different kinds of corn. That's just my people, okay? 760 kinds of cucurbits, that's pumpkins, squashes, and so on. Think about, if you ever get a chance after this talk, maybe Google Lakota squash, and you get an image of a squash that is almost 18 inches long. It's sort of this gray greenish kind of color, and you can feed a family for a week on it. They're just so huge, these Lakota squashes. Different kinds of panic grasses. What the heck is a panic grass? It's a relative, actually, of teosinte and Tripsicum, which are the early genetic relatives of corn. Some of you who have studied this will remember that corn was actually created by people. If humans were to disappear from the face of the earth, corn would leave right after us, because it requires humans in order to repropagate. We actually created corn. But before there was corn, there were native grasses like teosinte and Tripsicum. And then somewhere starting around 9,000 years ago, I'm guessing it was probably native woman down along the Rio Balsas River in Michoacan in Mexico, started to mess around with hybridizing teosinte and Tripsicum. That's probably the most likely plants, maybe panic grass, who knows, and created the earliest kind of corn that we think of today. And over time, the cob just kept getting bigger and bigger and changing colors as well. So that's, panic grasses are these land race of grasses that are edible and are related to other grasses like corn and so on. One of my favorite things, up to 35 different kinds of chili peppers. Okay. And just in my homeland, 14 different kinds of oaks. And y'all know that oaks are going to produce edible nuts, the acorns. So very important kind of plant that is not really domesticated, but we've played a direct role in increasing the output of trees like oaks. In other words, through our land management practice, I've been mentioning all along, we don't just wait for the oaks to do their thing. Later this year, all across California and in my homeland, places like New Mexico and so on, wherever there's these oaks that Native people still rely on, we'll go and we'll gather the oaks that have fallen onto the ground, making sure not to grab the ones that have little pinholes in them because little critters have crawled in there already and eaten out the insides. But then smacking the heck out of the branches and oftentimes breaking the branches to not only bring down more of the acorns, but it's a form of pruning. And any of you who raise roses and other kinds of shrubs like that know that when you prune a lot of plants like that, they actually produce more fruits, more and more beautiful flowers. And we're doing the same thing with things like oaks, for example. Different kinds of ground nuts, all sorts of different kinds of cactus fruits. Who knows how many different kinds of berries all throughout North and South America. And I bet you some of you are probably wondering, what the heck is a farkleberry? And, and there's salmon berries and so on. Pawpaw are another kind of one of these land races that over time have become heirloom kinds of crops that are unique and endemic to certain places and where humans have had a direct role in maintaining their unique locally adapted population. Papachi is another example. It's a kind of fruit, if you were to see it, that my people take advantage of. They grow in these tall shrubs. They're about this big, and they are these spiny looking things. You would never think of eating one, but when you pop them open, they're just really sweet and tasty inside and juicy. Different kinds of wild rices that still the Ojibwe, the Aksawana up there in Minnesota and Wisconsin still take advantage of growing naturally and harvesting later in the summer and early fall. If you've never had true wild rice, not the one you buy in like Trader Joe's and so on, but true wild rice, grown and collected sustainably by the Ojibwe, you should get some. You can go to different places online and get it, and you'll never go back. It's just incredible. Your body will thank you for eating that kind of wild rice. And so, I'm going to speed up here because I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to go ahead. I already mentioned the humans as a keystone species. What I want to get to is just some examples today of all of this talk I've been giving you. What can we do with it? What can some of you do with it? Maybe you're thinking, how can I apply this to my work? How can I apply this to my understanding already of what I know about land management and landscape architecture, any kind of different kinds of work that the audience is involved in? One of the first things to do is, if you truly wanted to get an Indigenous perspective, is talk to us. This is a picture of my people actually talking to me, because I'm one of the people, but of course, I've lived up here in North America, north of the border, and curious, how these traditions carry on. And what you see here are one of the local, I guess you would say, activist groups among my people. Like I said, there's 70,000 of us, but among us, there's 7 different dialects spoken, and we occupy different regions in and around the canyon system. My people are from down at the bottom of the canyon, 6,000 feet below the rim, which is up at 8,000 feet. And so my traditional ecosystem is different than what you see up here. This is up on the rim. So the plants, everything's different. And so, they're just answering my questions with regards to how they are managing their landscape, how they're dealing with the narco traffickers, how they're dealing with the Mexican loggers and so on. One of the most amazing things I learned is that because it's up on the rim, it's more arid, even though it gets up to 10,000 feet in elevation. They are doing some of the most simplest things. They're going along different places and building these little check dams. The picture is a little big. This check dam is only about 2 feet high. And they're just building these little check dams. There's another one right here. You can kind of see it behind this grassy thing here. And there's a couple more of these little check dams. And you may be wondering, what's going on? Well, because of the increased logging and the narco traffickers forcing my people off certain landscapes, the land has been ignored. And because it's been ignored, because we haven't been managing it in certain places like it should be, it is getting overgrown. It is becoming actually more arid. The water table has been dropping in certain places. And so in places where we've been able to push back the loggers, with the help of the local governments, and with the help of outside organizations, nonprofits, and so on, where we've been able to push out the narco traffickers, we've been bringing back the water table by doing simple things like these check dams. And it's just incredible what happens. You build these little check dams in strategically located places, and you'll get just enough of a water buildup and backup. This is one of the bigger ones here. This is like a big, large scale check dam here. But the result is the year before, when I came out to this place here, you can see the beautiful pine growth here in our homeland. This was totally dry, but because of a check dam that's downstream, you see right here, right behind this shrub that's just starting to bloom, and then back over towards the back of the little draw here. It's called an arroyo in Spanish. The water table has come back just by simple little check dam things. And this is a result of knowing how the land operates over, the thousands of years that I've mentioned. And there's a close-up of the water table that has come back up. And then finally, I want to end with a project that I'm involved in here today that might make a little more sense to you who are involved in modern landscape architecture and land management and so on. Where I'm at right now, where I teach at California State University, East Bay, we are in our campus is located in the homeland of the Muwekma Ohlone. And if you've ever been to the Bay Area, we got this huge San Francisco Bay here, and the Ohlone were never agriculturalists. They've always taken advantage of what this landscape has offered them in the bay, and in the fishing, and the plants, the acorns I mentioned earlier, growing along the coastal area. So they've lived here sustainably for thousands of years, eating foods like this here, the shellfish, acorn bread. We got the different kinds of berries and nuts and so on. We got a clam over here. These are just traditional kinds of Ohlone foods. There's an Ohlone restaurant that's in Berkeley. If you ever get to the Bay Area, go check it out. And a couple of years ago on my campus, we started building this new huge complex. It's called the CORE building, C-O-R-E. And our new president got a hold of me and said, Enrique, I know what you do, I know you're an ethnoecologist and ethnobotanist. Can you help us plan the landscaping around this building? And I said, yeah, as long as we plant traditional California native Ohlone plants. Let's make it an ethnobotanical landscape. And she was like, yes, let's do it. And we've worked with some landscape architects located in San Francisco. And this is just one of the many plans that has been drawn up. And you see here a lot of my input. These are a lot of the plants that I have suggested we need to plant. It might be a little small for some of you, but here's a little blow up of some of them on the left side here, like purple needle grass, which is an edible green, blue camas, which is a bulb that you can, that's also edible. It's like a wild potato, blue dix or nahavita, which is another kind of wild potato, yerba buena, which is a medicinal, plant that you can use for colds and stomach problems, and purple sage, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And I struck out, they wanted to include beaver tail cactus, but I said, no, that's not really a native plant to the Bay Area anyway. Let's not include that one. So they really have been paying attention to me. And so that's, like I said, this is one of the many drawings. And one of the other things I've suggested, let's not just plant plants. Let's not just make it a sort of living dictionary of native plants that people can maybe look up and learn the names of and uses of. Let's figure out how to make it reflective of a Ohlone worldview in relationship to the place that I've been mentioning this whole talk. And so along with the landscaping, they're going to include as much kind of artwork as possible, like sandblasting Ohlone images of certain plants. Maybe we're going to have an Ohlone muralist come and do some mural alongside, reflecting their relationship to place. And one of my favorite things is that we're going to have these posts all around the landscaping with, on the top are going to be these QR codes. My students have been writing plant descriptions and working with local Ohlone elders that will include Ohlone knowledge of the plants and Ohlone names of the plants, and then the modern descriptions of the plants, scientific names, and what they're used for by the people and so on, how to identify them. And so that when a person who's interested can come and scan the QR code with their phone and have all this information come immediately to them. But the posts are going to be mounted in stylized foundations of Ohlone baskets. Another thing that's happening is that we've been given permission we're going to start this Friday, actually 2 days from now. We're going to do a preview garden because the building is still being completed. And so my students and I are going to come. We've been the campus facilities management office, surprised the heck out of me. They actually got a hold of me. I didn't have to ask them. They said, hey, we'll give you this piece of land on campus in front of the science building. Go plant some native plants there. And so my students and I Friday are going to do exactly that. We're going to take advantage of this place. We're going to put some signage up here, reflecting again, all these things I've been mentioning. And this is my hand-drawn plan of the planting we're going to be doing here. I gave it to facilities. They put it on their AutoCAD system, and this is what they came up with. And on Friday, we're going to start doing this. We got the facilities ordered a bunch of plants. We also have a bunch of native seeds, and we're going to go and start planting. Hopefully it doesn't rain out as it's supposed to rain, but we'll just wear rain jackets. We'll see. And again, you see an example of things like red huckleberry. Here's that nahavita again in the purple needlegrass, but then manzanita, which is a very important native plant, useful for so many things here in the Bay Area for native peoples. Stinging nettle, which is a very, it's an immune booster, and it's just really good in salads and making drinks out of. And I can just go on and on. I'm an ethnobotanist. This is what I do. I just love this sort of stuff. At the same time, we have a satellite campus out near a town called Concord. And I've already had my students out there doing a similar project where we're doing experimental agriculture, where you see here, we're planting on a hill to take advantage of the moisture working downhill. And they're even doing their own check dams. Someone brought these big pile of stones that my students are going to have to transfer and make check dams. We want to experiment with placing them and what happens, see if we can raise the water table out in our Concord campus here. And the students love it. And we're working with Ohlone folks. They're feeling recognized. They're feeling honored. And I'm just so happy to be doing this kind of work. This is one of my favorite students here. Her name is Starlisa, planting just a little tiny local oak. And we can't wait to see what happens to it in 20 years. See what happens to that oak. And I'm going to finish there. And I still have a couple of minutes, but I know that we also have what did they call that? The garden room or something like that.
Yes. Thank you so much. That was delightful and felt delicious.
It is delicious.
Yes. And especially I'm a designer, I'm a landscape architect, so seeing the drawings and the plans was really enticing. And that must be such a treat to be able to actually plan out all these plants that you have such knowledge of and being able to put them in the landscape. So
Yeah, I
that
forgot to
was-
mention in the landscaping, we're creating all these little micro habitats. And the landscape architects we're working with are just overjoyed to do this kind of work.
Well, thank you so much, Enrique. We just have maybe about a minute left for this time, but we do have time in the speaker garden. And so I've asked folks to put any questions they have in the chat, and we'll make sure that we put it in a document so that folks can ask you in the speaker garden. But we sincerely appreciate your time. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the fourth and final session in the relationships with the land track of the first day of the conference. My name is Sandra. I serve on the ELA Board of Directors, and I'll be your host for the session. You've heard this before, and we encourage you to be on camera for the session to foster an interactive learning community. We're sure you'll enjoy hearing from our last but not least presenter in this track, Linda and Luke Black Elk. We got a duo on one screen. It's awesome. And again, we are so grateful for our conference sponsors, Pleasant Run Nursery, Understanding Ag, Soil Health Academy, TickSuit, and Ernst Seeds. Please do stop by and visit their booths, check out their materials, set up appointments with them, and reach out to them if you got any questions, and share your information as well. Additionally, we'd like to point you to a few housekeeping items and notes to ensure you have the best possible experience. And you know the drill by this point. So post your questions in the Zoom chat as they come up, because what we're going to do is take them and put them into a document, make sure we ask all the questions or have them on hand for the Q&A session. And if the presentation's so awesome as we know it will be, there's also time right afterwards in the speaker garden where you'll have more time to ask the Q&A in a more intimate setting. So don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to ask your questions if we can't get to it right after the presentation in this space. If you need CEUs, the tabs in the main space provide you with detailed instruction on what's required and what you'll need to do to ensure you receive the proper CEUs from the provider. After this presentation, we'll be having a happy hour where we're inviting folks to join networking rooms based on your geographic locations. So if you haven't yet, go to your profile on KikoChat, which is the event platform, and go to the top right and make sure you edit your profile and enter your location if it's not already there. And that way everybody can see who's here on this conference in the map. And you can also check out others and where they're located. Also, don't forget to check the main space for other good information, whether they be job posting, schedule information, registration for tonight's keynote with Nancy Lawson, if you haven't done that already, other Lacey's information, so on and so forth. So remember that main space is your place to go find the things that you'd like to find. And again, that final reminder that if you haven't yet registered for tonight's keynote session with Nancy Lawson, where she'll be talking about a world of discoveries, how science and heart can make you a more ecological gardener. So bring your own dinner, join us back here at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 p.m. Pacific for that great inspirational talk. And now on to our final session with Linda and Luke Black Elk. Luke and Linda Black Elk are food sovereignty activists and teachers of traditional plant uses, gardening, food preservation, and foraging. They spend their time collecting and preparing traditional foods and medicines for Indigenous peoples and communities in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and beyond. Luke is one of the founding board members of the Tatanka Wakpala Model Sustainable Community, which is a native nonprofit on the Cheyenne River Nation focusing on traditional building design, permaculture, food sovereignty, and a return to Lakota spirituality as a guide for everyday life. Linda is the food sovereignty coordinator at United Tribes Technical College, where she teaches ethnobotany and traditional skills. Together, Luke and Linda sit on the board of Mokoche Ikichupi, a native nonprofit which is reparative justice project on Dakota lands in Minnesota. Linda and Luke make sure their 3 sons stay involved in all of this important work so they may learn about the importance of feeding themselves and their communities with food and medicine that nourishes and heals mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Please join me in welcoming Luke and Linda Black Elk.
Hi, everybody. It's so awesome to be here with you guys today. Just to sort of set the stage, I want you guys to know that I checked the temp a couple minutes ago, and up here on the prairies of North Dakota, it's about -26 Fahrenheit. And we have a big storm coming according to the radar. So we'll see what happens. Our signal is always really good, so I wouldn't worry about that. But if you are somewhere warm and safe and cozy, send us good thoughts. I'm Linda Black Elk, and thank you for that beautiful introduction, Sandra. I am the Food Sovereignty Coordinator at United Tribes Technical College here on the homelands of the Lakota and Dakota peoples. And this is also the homelands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people. And I'm so happy to be here with you all today. This is my husband, Luke.
Hello, everybody. My name is Luke Black Elk. As Sandra said, I'm a founding board member of Tatanka Wakpala Model Sustainable Community and also the farm coordinator for Mokoche Ikichupi.
Yep. And yeah, we just wanted to talk a little bit today about medicinal landscapes. And I'll go ahead and share my screen with you all if that's okay. If you have any questions, make sure to put them in the chat. We really want to hear what you all have to ask and to say. But something that I would really like for you all to do is to think about a place that you've been. Okay, really think about this. A place that you've been where you came away from that space feeling healed in some way, right? A place that you've been that made you just feel better about everything and made you feel like, you know, maybe that a piece of yourself had received some medicine. And I want you to think about what it was about that space that made you feel healed. When we're surrounded by spaces that reflect our culture and our values, we feel more at home, and we even feel like that space is medicine in some way. As an ethnobotanist, as a woman of color, I truly believe that plants are our relatives, and I believe that they're sentient and communicative. That's really important. That's something very important to know about me. And my husband feels the same way. It's one of the many things that we have in common. We feel more at home and more comfortable and more valued when we're surrounded by plants that we recognize. It's like being surrounded by family. right? So if you know plants, then you feel like they're your friends. You feel like they're your relatives. My grandma always used to say that you know you're not home. You know that you don't necessarily belong in a space if you don't know the plant communities that are there and surrounding you. And that's because plants really change our relationship to space. Creating medicinal landscapes is about way more than just plant identification. Enrique, earlier, if you were on Enrique's talk a minute ago, he mentioned this about, this is more than just creating lists of plants that we can identify, right? This is about creating spaces filled with medicine that heals us mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Okay. And so we just want to share some of our experiences and ideas and even questions that we have and that we face all the time with you when it comes to ethnobotany and medicinal landscapes. So what does a medicinal landscape look like? Okay. Medicinal landscapes, these, they look like many different things, and they come in many different forms and are put together in many different levels, right? A medicinal landscape, if you're thinking of the place that you felt like was healing, that healed you, that was medicine for you, maybe you could even put a short description of it in the chat and why it was so healing for you. But if we think about them, medicinal landscapes really heal communities. That's really the point of them. They respect community goals and they reflect community goals, not your goals. I had to put that in there, right? Because I have personally worked with landscape architects and other people who really had their own vision for what a landscape should look like, and it didn't necessarily reflect the goals of the community. And that's tough because I'm also someone who's neurodivergent. And so going outside of the box of what I think something should be is sometimes very difficult for me. But when I'm working with communities, I have to put their goals first. And so should all of you. So one question that I always ask myself when I'm looking at an area, when I'm looking at a landscape, is how did it get this way, right? So when I walk onto a space that somehow like maybe community wants to change, I ask myself, how did it get this way? So on the left side of this picture of this screen is an intact prairie, okay? And on the right side of the screen is where I currently work, United Tribes Technical College. That's a tribal college located in Bismarck, North Dakota. If you're not familiar with the tribal college system, you can look it up, tribal colleges and universities. But tribal colleges are fully accredited colleges and universities that serve tribal populations, okay? And United Tribes is right here. And on the left is sort of what the United Tribes campus looked like back in the 1800s, okay? It was all prairie. But before this became United Tribes Technical College, this land went through a lot. Back in the mid 1800s, it was a military training camp. So I'm gonna go clockwise. That photo up on your top left, United Tribes was a military training camp. And actually, if you saw in the first photo, some of those buildings still exist to this day. Then, unfortunately, during World War II, United Tribes became a Japanese internment camp. And there were a lot of Japanese citizens, a lot of American citizens who were held there against their will. And that was just one, if we look back at this photo when it was a military training camp, it's really difficult because a lot of the people you see in this photo, they weren't being sent overseas necessarily to defend the United States. They were actually being sent out to quell indigenous uprisings, to kill our people. And so, having that military training camp on traditional lands really scarred the landscape. And then for this other like crazy atrocity to happen on this space, turning it into an internment camp for American citizens of Japanese descent, was another scar that was put on the landscape. After it was an internment camp, it actually became a training center for Peace Corps. And there were a few other things that happened there. I think the Civilian Conservation Corps had an office on campus at one point, or at least on what's now campus. And then it became, like I said, a Peace Corps training site. And then in 1969, as you can see in this lower right-hand corner, was the opening ceremony for the United Tribes Technical College. So that was a little while ago as well. So United Tribes has gone through a lot to become what it is today. If you are someone who has ever been on a landscape that has maybe changed a lot over time, you might know that you can feel it. You can feel all of the things that have happened in that space. They leave an indelible spiritual, mental, emotional, and even physical mark. The markings of the fact that this was a military training camp, and even the fact that it was an internment camp for people of Japanese descent is still there. Those markers are definitely still there on campus. And so when we ask ourselves, how did it come to be this way? How did the United Tribes campus come to look the way that it looks now, as you can see in that photo on the right? We really have to think about all of those things. And especially because as Indigenous people, a lot of ceremony is held on this campus. So how do we try to heal all of the scars left by the former uses of that land? It's something that we all think about. And it's still a question that United Tribes is answering, right? We do a lot of medicinal plantings. We do all kinds of things. We do all kinds of ceremonies. We're in the works of putting a memorial to the American citizens of Japanese descent who were held there. You know, there's all kinds of things that we are doing to try to heal this space. But when we get to a space, it's really something important that we all have to ask. How did it get this way? Another question we have to ask is, what are our community's goals? What are the goals of the community that we're working with? I actually was working with a community, not a community. I was working with a landscape architect recently who was working with a community, and their idea for part of the landscape was to put up a sign with a land acknowledgement. And I don't know how many of you all do land acknowledgements or have been part of land acknowledgements, but they actually have gotten kind of a bad reputation.
A lot of Indigenous people feel like it's sort of mocking the fact that the land is no longer belonging to them. And so there's actually a really great guide on the screen. I don't know if you can get to it from there, but I think this will be available later, or you can take a picture of that and go there. How to go beyond land acknowledgement, a guide for that, because there can be more.
A land acknowledgement is an acknowledgement. It's great to acknowledge that, but yeah, like Luke was saying, a lot of Indigenous people look at land acknowledgements almost as if they're saying, yeah, this land used to be yours, and that's it. Right? There's no apology, and then there's no moving beyond that. There's no action. We talk about the 3 A's: acknowledgement, apology, and action. And there's no action taken. And a land acknowledgement does one thing. It just recognizes whose hands the land used to be in. So we really want to move beyond that. It's not enough. We really need to learn communities' goals by talking to them directly, hiring community members, making sure that within our budgets, there's always room to hire and visit with community members and consult with them, right? Because their time and knowledge is valuable. Be willing to make changes that you don't necessarily understand. If an elder or other people say to you, no, we want this area left alone, and we don't want to talk about it, respect that. There's a reason, right? And they don't have to tell you. Okay, put the community's goals first. Just when we're talking about community goals, projects will often not have the goal. I remember working with a lot of restoration ecologists, and the big question, if any of you all are restoration ecologists, the big question is always, what are we restoring this land back to? How far back are we going, right? Full on restoration, like pre-colonial restoration, often is not the goal of a space. As is the case, I don't know how many of you have had the great fortune to visit Owamini. That's the new, fairly new Native American restaurant in Minneapolis. If you've ever heard of Chef Sean Sherman, he's also known as the Sioux Chef, S-I-O-U-X chef, because he's Lakota. And he has built this beautiful restaurant that actually used to be a mill, a grain mill. And, you know, there were a lot of things that happened on this land as well. Owamini actually means the place of the swirling water. And that's because there were gorgeous waterfalls in this area until the river was dammed. And those waterfalls no longer exist. But it's still a very important place to Dakota people. But it was basically all plowed over and cemented, paved over. You know, so the question that they had when they were renovating this space into this beautiful, amazing restaurant that was going to serve healing food is, how do we also reclaim the outdoor spaces? And, you know, the goal was not to turn this into like a pre-colonial riparian area. The goal instead was to educate. So lots of medicinal plants. Here you can see Dahlia purpurea, the purple prairie clover. There's a lot of gorgeous oaks and other native trees planted here that are both edible and medicinal. There's a lot of wild onions that were planted in here. A lot of what we call golden Alexander put in here. Tons of beautiful edible and medicinal plants everywhere. And of course, you know, you have to think about the entire landscape where these stairs are to make sort of an amphitheater. We knew that people would be walking over the beds without necessarily thinking about what was planted there. So we had to plant medicine that was also resilient. Luckily, there are all kinds of beautiful medicinal and edible and ceremonial plants that fulfill all of these needs and all of these niches. But this space became really beautiful, and it became a really educational space, which was the primary goal of the people who were building the restaurant. So it's very important to think about community goals, no matter what they are and no matter how simple they are. So lots of medicinal plants and lots of signage in this space in both the Dakota language and the Ojibwe language, because those are the two tribes that have come together in this space. Another example, so is the Native American Community Clinic, which is also in Minneapolis. Not a space that was worried about educating the public. This is a space where they were more concerned with making some plants more accessible to people who come to the clinic, specifically elders, right? So in the first case with Owamini, very much concerned about educating all the people, no matter what culture they're from, who come to the restaurant. When it comes to NAC, the Native American Community Clinic, they wanted to take this, you know, largely paved space with a huge parking lot in front and just make some medicines available to elders. So here in the left photo, that's just a bed of sage, Artemisia ludoviciana, you know, which is the #1 plant that elders were asking for when they would walk through the door. And there are some other plantings in here that are really important to the people who frequent this space. So the goal here became accessibility. Now, this is a really important project to both of us. My husband and I both sit on the board of Makoche Ikikchupi, which translates as
Land recovery. And you can see here in the picture here that we have earth lodges. These are Dakota style earth lodges. There are many different indigenous cultures around the world, but also nationally, that use earth lodges as their primary domicile or primary home. And you can see that it is completely covered in natural dirt there. And we like to plant that back to native plants, because a part of this is about reestablishing relationships with the earth. You know, it's not just about reestablishing our relationships with the plants, but reestablishing those plants' relationship with our Mother Earth in the places that we used to live.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when we talk about it's kind of like when we talk about medicine, we don't just mean like Tylenol, right? We don't just mean like physical medicine, like we're taking this thing into our body. We're talking about how a landscape can be medicine for our souls, right? And so in this case, from Makoche Ikikchupi, where we are taking land that has been reclaimed, right? So Makoche Ikikchupi takes donations from settlers and settler allies, and we use that money to buy land back and put it in the hands of indigenous people. And then we don't just build like more square boxy houses on there that often are not healing spaces. We thought, okay, what kind of spaces are truly going to be medicine for the land and medicine for people? And so we build earth lodges, these round, beautiful structures. If you look, my husband calls them hobbit holes. If you look there on the right, wouldn't you want to live there? I mean, it's just a gorgeous space that's so comfortable and cozy. Yeah, you know, we thought, how do we make this, like change this soil's relationship with the plants around it? At this point, when this earth lodge was first built, this was just a bunch of like non-native invasive plants moving in, and we could let that happen. You know, that's not the most horrible thing in the world, but we really asked ourselves, how could we make these earth lodges medicine? So we consulted with elders, and one of the things that they said to us was that we had to have a lot of shallow rooted perennial plants. We could not use a lot. I mean, have you all, are you all familiar with prairie plants? They have some of the longest, most penetrating root systems in the world, right? Some grasses have roots that are regularly at least 5 feet long. If you have only a foot of soil on top of an earth lodge, you can't be using things like yucca, which we find up here, Yucca glauca, or Echinacea angustifolia. Those are beautiful prairie plants, but instead we need things that spread by rhizomes, things that stay closer to the surface of the soil. And these are just some of the plants that we chose that are perfect. And along with being shallow rooted perennials that are going to hold the soil in place, these are amazing medicines. These are indigenous medicines. When my husband looks at these plants or is surrounded by these plants, it is medicine. He can use all of these for medicine and make a different tea or salve or something out of them, but they're also medicine for the soul. Being surrounded by these plants is being surrounded by friends and family. We know their names, we know their stories, and we know their relationship to the rest of the universe.
So in indigenous thought, it's not just us who have been colonized. It's just, you know, we as human beings have been colonized, and we feel bad about that. But it's not just us. We have to remember that our relatives, and these are really our relatives, we really have relationships with each one of these plants, have also been colonized. They've been pushed out by monoculture. They've been pushed out by planting practices that don't go with their lifestyle, with their growth pattern. They lack things like periodic burning. You know, So these are plants that have also been colonized and that we need to regenerate in our spaces.
Yep. And it's also very important to remember, and we can give lots of examples of this, but we are just part of the landscape. We're not separate from it. We're not above it. We're not below it. We are part of the landscape. And many of these plants need us in the same ways that we need them. It's a reciprocal relationship. If I'm sure some of you all have read Robin Kimmerer's seminal work, Braiding Sweetgrass, in which she talks about the fact that sweetgrass grows better when it's in right relationship with human beings. That's not just sweetgrass that benefits from people. All of these plants do when these plants are cared for in right relationship. So I'm not going to name this space, but I wanted to talk about some more examples, but also some of the obstacles that we face when we're doing this type of work, when we're creating medicinal landscapes. Okay, so if you look at that aerial photo on the left of the space with the trees, right, you can see this was actually once a low riparian area here along the river, but because a series of dams were put along the river, you can't really see it, but there's actually a very tall cliff here that now prevents any flooding of this area. So back in the day, back in the 40s and 50s, this was actually all riparian area filled with riparian plants like cottonwood and willow. Once the flooding stopped, after those dams were built, ash, Fraxinus pennsylvanica, green ash, came in to those spaces. That's just secondary succession for those types of areas. And so this is a huge ash forest with some understory, not a really diverse understory, but some understory. But that forest is the only forest that the only really thicker forested area that the indigenous people around here have. And so it's very important to them. And if you talk to elders, they'll tell you they need those trees there. That's what they say. We need those trees. Unfortunately, a fungus, Perenniporia fraxinophylla, has come in and it rots out the heart of all the ash trees. So looking at this aerial photo, 99% of the trees in that photo are dead or dying. And it is devastating to the community here. And so we have had to really look at the fact that, okay, we can't go back. Those dams are still on the river. So we can't go back to cottonwoods and willows. And we can't put ash there. So we have to find an alternative that's still going to meet the community's needs, that's still going to give them the forest that they want, the forested area that they want, while still realizing that things happen in this area that can quickly take this forest away. We can't put ash here. So we're really having to think about and talk to the community about their goals, and ask questions like, okay, what trees would you like to see here? You know, and ask questions like, okay, if, do you want them put in rows? Like, do we burn this area first? You know, this all can come from the community. Indigenous people have a really intimate relationship with the landscape going back thousands and thousands of years. We're talking about the first scientists of this land, and they know the land better than anyone. And so asking them for their input is always a really good idea first. And for those of you who are not familiar with Indigenous science and Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding the world, you might be very surprised at some of the amazing and really insightful answers that you get when you ask questions. Just another example, the primary goal, right now, we're actually working with some folks who really want more food planted in their area. A lot of their original choke cherries, as in this photo, Prunus virginiana, are gone. Prunus americana, gone. A lot of their Juneberries, Amelanchier alnifolia, gone. You know, and in order to really regain food sovereignty, in order to really take control of their food system, communities need more access to their traditional foods, right? And so we've talked a little bit about access, we've talked about visibility, things like that as goals. The goal of this community that we're working with right now is food sovereignty. The problem is, again, as with the ash, we're seeing a major disease hit choke cherries, okay? And actually, this black knot fungus affects a lot of Prunus species. And so the question that we get from elders and from people in this community is, do we just plant more? And do we keep planting them as time goes on? Do we or do we find something else to plant? Talk about your relationship with choke cherries.
I've had a lifelong relationship with choke cherries. It's a very important plant, not just to my people, but to my family. It's something that we use in our household, but also ceremonially, and when we go to community functions. And it's been very sad to see not only this disease, but there are other diseases that are affecting this particular species. And it's been very sad to see this happen throughout my lifetime and see old growth stands of choke cherry disappear just because there's no one caring for them, and there's no way to really fight this fungus that we know of yet.
So when someone says to you, oh, we can't put choke cherries there because they're just going to die because of black knot fungus, so let's find an alternative.
I would still plant them, I guess.
Because there's no alternative, right? So I actually surprised him with those questions because I wanted you all to just see there's no replacement for some plants. Even plants that you know may not make it for very long because of one thing or another. Maybe it's an area where the hydrology has changed, but some elders, some community members really want a plant that will last, a plant that reflects their relationship with the land that may not grow there or may not at least last long. It's still important to figure out alternatives that still meet that need. So we are in talks with people about whether or not a black knot fungus resistant choke cherry variety can be developed. But sometimes you have to go that big. Sometimes the project isn't just about planting more and more and more of them. Sometimes you plant a whole bunch of choke cherries knowing they're gonna get black knot eventually, in the hopes that eventually we will come up with a resistant variety that can be planted in there later. So it's about the community's goals and meeting those and realizing that people have a real relationship with these plants, not just in the way that we think of like a relationship with plants. Oh, I really love to eat avocados. That's my relationship with avocados. No, we're talking about a spiritual relationship. We're talking about people who are literally descended from certain plants, that meaning an actual physical descendancy from plants. And that can't be replaced with some other species or some, blight resistant variety. Okay, so I just wanted to provide some resources for you all, some cool books and websites to think about. I'm really honored that you guys could be here with us today and visit with us a little bit. And I'm so happy to leave time for lots of questions. And I know we'll end up in the room, but
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I took down furious notes. I'm sure folks also took down furious notes. I am going to ask folks, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll be sure to ask them. We have a couple minutes left in this room. Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody have a question? Yeah, oh yeah, go ahead.
So I see Russ's question about golden Alexanders having medicinal and ceremonial uses. So I won't talk about ceremonial uses on here, but I will say that yes, golden Alexanders, Zizia, I can't remember the species, but it is medicinal. It is very good for lungs, Russ. You can actually use the flowers in tea. As you know, I have asthma, and I have to say, as someone with asthma, being surrounded by plants that I know, you know, because I get concerned about my lung health. And so if I'm surrounded by plants that I know and recognize, and I think to myself, I could use that for medicine if I needed to for my asthma, it makes me feel more secure as well. So these medicinal landscapes can be a way of making people feel more comfortable. I remember I was in Europe a few years ago, and I was feeling so lonely and so homesick. And I remember driving, I was sitting in a bus seat, kind of feeling sorry for myself. And I saw plants that I recognized, you know, even over there in Europe. And I was like, oh, you know, and it made me feel better. And it actually, it was two plants for asthma. And I thought I don't know why, but it just made me feel a lot more secure seeing those. Like, hey, if I had to, I could use those for my asthma if I wanted.
That's so beautiful. We have 2 more questions. So another one from Russ, and I'll just read it verbatim. I think I see wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa, blooming there. Is that not right? FYI, that species is held high in regard by the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican tribe as the most frequently used medicinal plant by members of that tribe. Folks planting to benefit pollinators also like the species, as it's favored by at-risk species of wild bumblebees.
Do you want to talk about that, bee balm?
Oh yeah, bee balm is a very important plant to us too. We use it. It is a ceremony plant too. Almost all plants have some use in ceremony, one way or another. We actually will use that plant. The dried flowers and leaves, we'll crush them and rub the essence around our bodies to make ourselves not smell like human beings when we go into ceremony, if that makes sense. But we also use it as a food plant. It's a very good seasoning. I know our relatives down in the Southwest call it wild oregano, and we use it as an oregano replacement.
And it's a wonderful medicine. It is such good lung support, but it's also so antimicrobial. One of my favorite things about Monarda fistulosa, if you all don't know scientific names, I apologize. Bee balm is one of the English names. Wild bergamot is another. It is such a gorgeous plant, but I love to do, I don't know how many of you all teach kids, maybe you homeschool, maybe you're science teachers, yay. But we get Petri dishes that come with the agar already in them. You know, you can buy them really inexpensively. And so they'll have the agar in there, and we'll have kids do swabs inside their mouth, and they'll incubate all the disgusting things that grow inside their mouths on these Petri dishes. It's actually a great way to get kids to start thinking twice about kissing other people, but we get them to do that, and then we'll have them use different herbs on those Petri dishes to see which of the herbs will inhibit the growth of of what's growing in the Petri dishes. And bee balm, Monarda fistulosa, just always knocks it out of the park. It will almost kill everything inside those Petri dishes. It's so antimicrobial. Such a powerful, beautiful plant to have around. So we love it.
Fascinating. What a great project. Next question is from Aviva. How do the earth lodges relate to the surrounding land?
The earth lodges relate to the surrounding land. One thing is that they're not an eyesore. When they're finished, they just look like a part of the earth. When I say they look like hobbit holes or hobbit hills or however you want to picture it, they just look like hills, especially when you replant them to native plants. It just looks like a part of the landscape. They're also made from all natural material, and so when 50 years from now, when it's time to build a new home, that home will just go right back into the earth, and there's no long-term effects from that.
Interesting. And I will say, I forgot, this is the last session, so we'll just stay here instead of going to the speaker garden. It's so much easier for folks. No one has to move and we can just roll right through. Okay, so we got more questions. So Sandra Power asks, first, thank you for your presentation. Just love to feel connected to you and hope the storm passes quickly. I'm wondering if the chokecherry companions like sassafras and staghorn sumac and sedges and goldenrods and asters are growing alongside it and possibly making a more resilient community?
Yeah, absolutely. We are huge fans of plant communities. And so one thing that we really notice about plants, and I first learned this from Indigenous elders, and then like you can actually see this reflected in people who look at plant medicine as well. But when plants are growing in their communities, surrounded by their friends and relatives, they actually have more medicine. They you can look at, for instance, yarrow, Achillea millefolium yarrow, that is grown in someone's garden, does not have anywhere near as many medicinal compounds as yarrow that's growing out on the prairie or on the margins in a meadow. Out there where it's surrounded by its friends and relatives, it just gets stronger. So it's important to think about those things. So bee balm is actually called bee balm because it is medicine for bees. Literally, it's medicine for people, but it's also medicine for bees. So all of these plants exist in communities, not just with other plants, but with us and with the insects and with all the wildlife. And so, when we have these relationships and we encourage, as humans, encourage these relationships, we definitely have a positive impact on the landscape, and they impact each other positively as well.
I have a question that comes up later, but I'll ask it at the end. Sonia asks, I really was interested when your husband said his family used chokecherry as food and ceremony. Can he talk more about what his family did with it? Was it jellies and jams or other uses? I know it can be made into liquor and also liqueurs. Was any other use that you can use it for?
There are many uses that we use it for. Actually, didn't learn how to make jelly until I was an adult, jams and jellies. So one of the main uses is this is actually chokecherries here. I don't know how well you can see those. You can kind of see some of the pits in there still. And that's one thing about my people and many indigenous cultures is that we don't just use the fruit, we use the whole, we don't just use the soft part of the fruit, we use the whole fruit. So we crush the seeds and use the insides. If you read about chokecherries in field guides and a lot of things like that, they'll tell you that they're toxic. They can be. There are small amounts of cyanide within the seed pits, but when the seeds are crushed and combined with the juice of the fruit, that will actually dissipate and off gas, and you don't have to worry about it. So this is a food that we will take it fresh, or we will take it dried, and we will make it into a couple of things. One is something called wojapi, which is kind of like a thick fruit pudding, and so we'll add maple syrup or maple sugar to that and consume that. We'll also use this in a dish that we call wasna. You may have heard of it referred to as pemmican, which is the Anishinaabe word for it, which is dried meat and fat and berries and a little sugar, which is sort of like the Cliff Bar of our people. It's what we would send our hunters and our warriors with when they went on long trips. And it's actually, it's power food. It's actually become a super important ceremony food. So when we have gatherings and things like that, this is how we reach out to our ancestors. We'll feed them a little bit of food that they know, and we'll consume a little bit of that at the same time to make that connection. We'll also make juice from this plant, fresh or dried. We'll rehydrate these and take the strong tea, you could call it, and drink that, especially after long fasts, because it's supposed to. I hate to talk about Gatorade, but it's kind of like Lakota Gatorade. So when we were on long fast, we would actually use this to reintroduce ourselves to eating. Yeah, and then of course I've learned how to make jellies and jams with it, and love doing that. And there's a number of other things. Cough syrup, we make cough syrup from it with honey, it's a really excellent cough syrup. You can do anything with it.
Yeah, we make barbecue sauces with it now. Like we put choke cherries in everything. I mean, it's just, really, it's an important part. And as you could see, because I was eating it rudely right in front of you guys, it's hard to not do that. These choke cherry patties are so full of the pits that they say that one pit, one patty like this, would be enough to kill a 250-pound man. But that indigenous science, that knowledge of knowing how to process these is just so brilliant, and it leaves them totally edible. So even though some people will say, oh gosh, that grainy texture of the pits really bothers me, if you talk to any elders, they'll say you have to have the pits, because that's where all the medicine is. The medicine is in the pits. That's where all the complex carbohydrates are. That's where all the protein is. That is where all the literal medicine is. All that stuff that actually helps to open up your breathing passages and lower blood pressure. It's all in the pits, and they taste like almonds like this. So like when I was eating this, it's because we've eliminated refined sugar from our diet. So this is what we eat when we want something sweet, and it tastes like cherry almond bark.
Where do we find those?
Gotta make them yourself or come see us.
Yes. Great. Next question. Elizabeth Green asks, how are huge projects like the big wall along the river vetted or perhaps prevented? In my city, we have multinational coalition of people fighting to save green space from big developers, and it's been a tremendous struggle thus far.
It's people, you have to gather people and struggle and fight. It's really a never-ending battle against capitalism. It's difficult, but it's not hopeless either.
It's I think one of the reasons why this is actually an emotional question for us. Today is 6 years since we as a family were kicked out of the No DAPL camps. And so when we talk about like how we make positive changes, that's the camps that were set up to fight the Dakota Access Pipeline on Standing Rock. So today is literally 6 years to the day when we got kicked out of there. And so when we talk about making changes and how to change these landscapes, we really have to fight for that change, you know, and we're willing to do it. But it's so good to have allies in that fight. And it's so good to have people willing to listen to what communities want and need. Because the fact is, like, when we talk about the forested area and the down cutting of the Missouri River due to the dams that were put in there, it's going to take a lot to make real change there. We can plant all the trees we want in that area, but what the community really wants is for the dams to be taken out and for the cottonwood forests and the willows to come back, and that diverse understory in those cottonwood forests to come back, right? Land back. But you know, that is something that is like, we're very patiently working toward it. But it's happening, right? If you have heard about the dams along the Klamath, a lot of those are being taken out now. Change is happening. It takes time. Yeah.
Great. We've got a couple more questions. Sonia says, sorry, I missed something you said earlier. Were you talking about wild bergamot crushed and wiped as a body and head cleanser?
Not as a head cleanser, though it does cleanse your mind a little bit. We take the dried plant and crush it, and we rub it on ourselves to make ourselves more pleasing to our ancestors when we go into ceremonies.
Yeah, there's no way. He's speaking hesitantly because there's no. It's hard to put those concepts in English of like. We smell like humans, and humans don't smell good to the spirits. So
there you have it. Okay. A couple more questions. Christy Dustman asks, I'm fascinated and so touched by how you're talking about plants. I have felt like a freak to feel like plants are my friends. In fact, at a presentation I did last night, I admitted that I have a few plants that are my best friends. Thank you for that, Christy.
I love that, Christy. Go plants. We feel the same way.
Sonia asks, do you have plans for a cookbook?
Yes. But it's just plans.
It's just plans. We get asked that all the time, and you know, have been approached by a few people. Okay. Our 7-year-old has gotten a little impatient. So we definitely do. And you know, it's kind of hard because really what we've shared with you all today, none of this belongs to us. None of this knowledge, none of these stories, none of this belongs to us. It belongs to, you know, it belongs to the people who gave that knowledge to us in a good way. And so it's hard to think about putting those things in a book. But my husband is an amazing chef, and like so we have been thinking about it and thinking about how to go about it. But we're a lot more extreme when it comes to indigenous foods than, as you can probably see, we're a lot more extreme when it comes to indigenous food than a lot of people are. Like if you think about your, like how many bay leaves do you have in your house? Sandra, how many bay leaves do you have in your house right now?
I don't know, actually. Like
no,
five?
So this is our jar of bay leaves.
That's one.
And this is just one. We have like 3 like this. We use a lot of indigenous foods and herbs. Yay, Lauren, that's our favorite. This is California Bay, and it's our favorite. And we put it in everything. But you know, that's not it. Like this is a jar of dried squash, and we have like 6 or 7 of these. This is dried winter squash. So we are going to make a cookbook. We're just, like I said, a lot more extreme than most people. But if you need a cookbook, an indigenous foods cookbook, the Good Berry Cookbook by Tashia Hart, H-A-R-T, is wonderful. And then also, of course, there's the Sioux Chef's cookbook, S-I-O-U-X by Sean Sherman. That's a great cookbook as well. There's a few others around, so.
Great. Now we've got a question in the audience. Russ, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you. Hi. Let me just take my hand down. So I wish you had been with me this summer. Up in August, I was in Down East Maine in Passamaquoddy territory, and we must have passed hundreds of chokecherry bushes loaded with fruit. And so I asked somebody who works for the Passamaquoddy tribe, don't you folks eat these fruits? And he said, well, I'm Dine, I married a Passamaquoddy, but where I'm from, yeah, of course we eat them. So he asked his wife and he said, no, we don't eat them. And so she said it might be lost knowledge. And so my hunch is that, many years ago, of course, the tribes knew about chokecherries and ate them. And after colonialism, that knowledge was severed, the relationship with that plant was severed. And so I'd love to help rekindle it. And so, but I want to do it in respectful ways. So, I'd love to, reintroduce folks to that plant and say, here's this relative of yours that's been waiting for you to reestablish a relationship with. Let's try it. Let's nibble on the berries. Let's try to make some stuff from the fruits. So I hope you think that would be a good idea.
That's a wonderful idea, and it's very true. My family is different. We held on to that, but there are many families in my community who believed the field guides and were like, oh well, we can only eat the fruit. And then there would be elders who would say, this isn't right. It needs the pits in it still, and so it's taken years of slowly working at this to get people reintroduced to this, and it's still an ongoing process.
And also, Russ, it's called choke cherry for a reason. It is full of tannins and it is dry. And so it does need to be processed. And so, that I think that's why a lot of people now, when they eat it, they want it as syrup or jelly, having it in these traditional ways. We have to change our relationship to chokecherries in order to really make them a part of our diet again, and say to ourselves, hey, a little bit of bitter is okay. A little bit of dry is okay. I love bitter foods, so I'm on a real push for that. But I really appreciate. I wanted to mention, Russ, the first word you used was that the knowledge was lost, and then you used the word severed, which is much more appropriate because nothing was lost. It's not just someone put it down and didn't want to pick it back up. These ways of knowing were violently taken and severed. And even, I don't know how many of you all are familiar with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. That is an act that finally gave people the right to harvest their traditional foods again. It was literally illegal to harvest these foods until 1978. That's within my lifetime. And it was illegal to harvest these for food, to harvest for medicine, to harvest for ceremony, to go into ceremony, to be native, to be indigenous was illegal until 1978, which is in my lifetime. So can you imagine why people up in Passamaquoddy don't eat chokecherries anymore, right? So, so definitely, it's great to reintroduce that to people in ways that are gentle and respectful. There's probably still elders up there who remember doing it, but just don't have anyone to go out and harvest them for them anymore. So.
Thank you, Russ.
And one other thing, and Robin Wall Kimmer writes about this very eloquently about plants that aren't originally from here, but came over from Europe, but were recognized by indigenous peoples as having value as food or medicinal plants like plantain, for example, and burdock and chicory. And so once they were, once the knowledge reached the indigenous people about the values of these plants, they said, well, this is great. We'll happily do these too. So, while the knowledge is very deep and is original with indigenous people for all the native plants, for these naturalized species that also, add something to us in terms of, food, medicine, other values, it's great to have them. I hope you feel that way too.
We do.
Oh, definitely. Though we have long discussions with many people, including Robin, about the fact that some of these plants weren't necessarily brought over and some of them are hybridized with plants of the same species that existed here pre-colonization, like burdock, like plantain, and a few others, but there very definitely is great use in some plants that weren't here before.
Yeah, and that's something when we're creating these medicinal landscapes, it's something that is important to remember. Plantago major, not necessarily indigenous, but Plantago regelii, same medicinal properties, totally native. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to use Plantago major if we can't find Plantago regelii, right? Dandelions, common misconception that they're introduced. Dandelions are native. They just crossed with native Taraxacum species to basically create something new, but still amazing. Burdock, there are two species, Arctium minus and Arctium lapa. Arctium minus is native, and most botanists are moving towards the belief that Arctium minus is the native species. And if you look at long-term traditional knowledge of indigenous people, they mention burdock prior to colonization. So yeah, great question.
We have to keep in mind that most of the information that was given to us by Eurocentric people, people who believe that everything that was good came from Europe, and that's just not true. There's a lot of plants that have come over. One is lovage, which is a great replacement for some rare plants. There's also ways that you can use colonizer plants or settler plants in place of indigenous plants that are on the verge of habitat loss.
Right. For example, the Japanese barberry, you can extract berberine from the roots, and that's an alternative source instead of the golden seal, which is a native species under some threat from harvesting pressure. So I also wanted to mention that I feel that the botanical repositories of information definitely underscore, when they look at the quote unquote native ranges of plants, they are not counting what indigenous peoples did for thousands of years of moving these plants around. And so, they set this arbitrary deadline. Well, if a plant was there in 1620 or 1492, whatever date they pick, that means it's native. But that still does not recognize the important role that humans had in expanding the ranges of so many plants, at least, in the East where I'm from, plants like pawpaw and black walnut and shagbark hickory and sweet flag and the American lotus. Those are all species that we know for sure Native Americans expanded their ranges because they saw the value of these plants, and through trade, like Jerusalem artichoke is a classic example. The early European explorers to this area, like the Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain types, saw Jerusalem artichokes growing everywhere in all the Native American encampments along the St. Lawrence River. And yet, the botanists will clear their throats and say, that's not a native plant to that area. It's native to, the upper Midwest. But yet the plant was there all over the place. And so that to me is just, well, that's just one story of one plant. There are many, many other stories of many other plants that are in places that the botanists think, well, that's a native species, but it's there because the Native Americans planted it there or traded for it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that people are medicine too. And my husband has a brother who is he is European. He's of European descent. But he's medicine for our souls, and non-indigenous plants can be medicine too. And that's okay. There's no judgment there. So thank you very much, Russ, for all of that.
Sure.
Well, that's a great way to end. And thank you, Luke and Linda, so much for your time and your knowledge and sharing with us all your work. And thank you for sharing your email in the chat. So folks, grab it while it's hot. Send Linda and Luke an email if you want to reach out to them. And so that concludes the session for today. We welcome everybody to hang out, to continue hanging out. There are networking rooms open by region if you want to go check out folks who are in your spot on earth and want to just kind of connect that way. And then stay tuned if you are registered for Nancy Lawson's keynote dinner later this evening. It's gonna happen soon, so please stick around for that. So thank you again so much.
Doksha.
Doksha, thanks everyone.